They called it justice when they held her down in the dirt. They called it family business when they sheared her hair like a sheep bound for slaughter. The whole town of Coldwater, Wyoming watched Clara Monroe's public destruction under the high noon sun, and not one soul moved to help her. Not until a lone rancher with ice in his eyes and gunpowder scars on his knuckles stepped through that silent crowd. He didn't ask permission. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at those brutal men and said 5 words that split the world in two. "She's coming with me." Welcome to a story of courage born from cruelty, where one man's defiance became one woman's second chance at life. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Clara's story travels across this world. The Dust Devils were dancing that Thursday morning when Clara Monroe made her fatal mistake. She walked into town alone. 3 months had passed since they buried Thomas Monroe in the hard Wyoming ground. 3 months since the fever took him in the night, while Clara held his hand and whispered prayers that went unanswered. 3 months since her world had narrowed to a single truth. She was a widow at 24, and in Coldwater, Wyoming, that made her less than a woman and more than a problem. The Monroe family had made their intentions clear from the funeral onward. Thomas's older brother, Clayton, had stood over the fresh grave with his hat in his hands and his eyes on Clara's land, speaking words that sounded like comfort but tasted like threat. "You'll need help now, Clara. A woman alone can't manage 160 acres. We'll take care of everything, the property, the livestock, the debts Thomas left behind. You just sign the papers and we'll make sure you're looked after proper." She'd refused. Politely at first, then firmly, then with a locked door and a loaded rifle across her lap through long, sleepless nights. That had been her first mistake. Her second was believing the law might protect her. Now, walking down Coldwater's main street with her marketing basket over her arm and her widow's black dress gathering dust at the hem, Clara Monroe was about to learn exactly what happened to women who said no to powerful men. The morning had started ordinary enough. She'd risen before dawn to feed the chickens, milk the cow, and check the fence line where Clayton's men had cut the wire 3 times in the past month. She'd baked bread because the routine of kneading dough kept her hands busy and her mind from spinning into dark corners. She'd changed into her town dress, pinned her honey brown hair into a neat bun, and hitched up the wagon for the 6-mile journey into Coldwater. She needed supplies: salt, flour, coffee, if she could afford it. More importantly, she needed to see Sheriff Hutchins about the dead calf she'd found that morning. Its throat cut clean and its body left at her doorstep like a message written in blood. The sheriff's office sat at the far end of Main Street, past the mercantile and the saloon, past the bank where Thomas had signed his name to loans his family now claimed Clara owed. She'd made it as far as the dry goods store when she felt eyes on her back like cold fingers tracing her spine. "Well, look what dragged itself into town." Clara's steps faltered, but didn't stop. She knew that voice. Clayton Monroe's middle son, a vicious young man named Derek, who'd grown up pulling wings off flies and graduated to meaner sport. "I'm talking to you, Clara." She turned, keeping her back straight and her chin level, the way her mother had taught her before the cholera took both parents and left Clara alone in the world at 16. "Monroe, I have business with the sheriff. Excuse me." Derek stepped into her path, and behind him materialized 2 more men, his cousin Jake and a hired hand called Silas Cord, who wore his gun low and his reputation lower. Clara's heart kicked against her ribs like a trapped rabbit. "Sheriff's busy," Derek said, his smile all teeth and no warmth. "Besides, the law can't help you with family matters." "We're not family," Clara said quietly. "Not anymore." Derek's smile vanished. "That's so. Seems to me you're still living on Monroe land, eating Monroe beef, breathing Monroe air. My daddy says you've confused charity with ownership." "The land is mine. Thomas left it to me, legal and proper. I have the deed." "You have paper." Derek stepped closer, and Clara caught the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "Paper burns real easy, Clara, just like everything else. Leave me be." Clara's voice remained steady, but her hands had started trembling, so she gripped her basket tighter. Around them, the morning street traffic had slowed. Shopkeepers paused in doorways. A woman with 2 children hurried them across the street, her face carefully blank. I'll scream. Scream all you want, Jake Monroe said from her left, cutting off her escape route. Ain't nobody in this town fool enough to cross the Monroe family over a woman with no people and no prospects. He was right, and they all knew it. Clara had learned that truth over the past 3 months, as neighbors who'd shared Sunday dinners suddenly found reasons to avoid her eyes, as shopkeepers who'd extended her credit for years now demanded cash she didn't have. As the invisible walls of isolation had closed around her, brick by brick, until she stood alone against a family with money, influence, and a mean streak as wide as the Wyoming sky. "What do you want?" Clara asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Sign the papers," Derek said. "Give up the land peaceable. Move along to Denver or Cheyenne or wherever unwanted women go. Do it today, and we'll let you walk away. Keep being stubborn." He shrugged, the gesture almost lazy. "Well, stubborn women tend to have accidents in this country." Clara's fear crystallized into something harder. "I won't." "Wrong answer." Derek's hand shot out and grabbed her arm, fingers digging into flesh hard enough to bruise. Clara's basket fell, scattering eggs across the boardwalk where they broke in pale yellow pools. She tried to pull away, but Jake caught her other arm, and suddenly she was being dragged not toward the sheriff's office, but toward the narrow alley between the bank and the harness shop. "Let me go!" Clara's voice rose, cracked, broke into something near panic. "Help! Someone help me!" Faces turned, watched, looked away. An old man on the mercantile steps shook his head sadly and went inside. A young cowboy moved like he might intervene, but his companion grabbed his shoulder and whispered something sharp, and the moment passed. No one was coming. No one would risk themselves for her. The alley was narrow and dark, smelling of rotting garbage and horse piss. Derek shoved Clara against the brick wall hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. Through watering eyes, she saw Silas Cord position himself at the alley mouth, arms crossed, blocking the view from the street. "You could have made this easy," Derek said, breathing hard, his eyes bright with something that made Clara's stomach turn. "But you had to be difficult. Just like you were difficult when Thomas was alive, filling his head with notions about standing up to family." "Thomas loved me." "Thomas was weak." Derek's hand wrapped around Clara's throat, not choking, but promising. "He married wrong. Pretty face, no family, no sense. And when he died, he left a mess we got to clean up." "The land is mine," Clara gasped. "Legal? Nobody gives a damn about legal." Derek's shout echoed off the brick walls. "This is Wyoming territory, and the Monroe family has run this valley for 30 years. You're nobody, nothing, and it's time you learned your place." Jake Monroe pulled a knife from his belt. Not a fighting blade, but a farmer's tool, worn handle, and an edge honed sharp for butchering livestock. Clara's eyes fixed on it with horrible fascination. "Hold her still," Jake said. Derek forced Clara to her knees in the alley filth. Hands gripped her shoulders, her arms. She struggled, bucked, screamed until Derek's hand clamped over her mouth, cutting off sound and air both. "You want to act like an animal?" Jake knelt beside her, turning the knife so it caught the thin stripe of noon sun penetrating the alley. "We'll brand you like one." He grabbed her hair, the neat bun she'd pinned that morning with such care, and yanked her head back. Clara felt the cold kiss of blade against her scalp and understood with crystal terror what was about to happen. The first cut was almost gentle, sawing through the thick rope of hair just above her collar. The bun fell into the dirt, coiled like a dead snake. Clara made a sound behind Derek's palm, something animal and broken. "Should have signed the papers," Jake said conversationally, cutting again. "Now the whole town's going to see what happens to women who forget their place." Handful by handful, he hacked away her hair. Not neat, not careful, rough and cruel, leaving patches short as stubble next to others sticking out in ragged tufts. Clara stopped struggling. What was the point? Her eyes leaked tears that carved clean tracks through the dust on her face, and in her chest, something fundamental began to break. Not her body, that was already broken, already beaten. Her hope, the last fragile belief that the world contained justice or mercy or basic human decency. "That's better," Derek said, and removed his hand from Clara's mouth. She dragged in air but didn't scream. Screaming required believing someone might care, and that belief had been cut away with her hair. Jake stood, brushing hair from his pants with fastidious disgust. Now, one more thing. He grabbed Clara's collar, the modest black dress she'd sewn herself after Thomas died, and ripped downward. Buttons scattered across the alley stones like teeth. Clara caught the torn fabric, trying to hold herself together, but Derek seized her wrists and held them wide while Jake tore the dress further, exposing her chemise, her shoulders, her dignity stripped away layer by layer. "Look at her," Derek said, and Clara realized with new horror that a crowd had gathered at the alley mouth. Not helping, watching. 30 or 40 people, maybe more, standing in the brutal noon sunshine and staring at her destruction with expressions ranging from discomfort to satisfaction. This is what happens when you defy the natural order. Remember that, all of you. Clara couldn't look at them. She stared down at the filthy ground, at her shorn hair lying in the mud like evidence of a murder, and felt herself disappearing, becoming less than human, less than real. Just an object lesson, a warning, a story to frighten other women into compliance. "We done here?" Silas Cord called from his post. "Sheriff's heading this way." "Almost." Derek pulled Clara to her feet, held her upright when her legs wouldn't support her weight. He turned her toward the crowd like a man displaying livestock at auction. "Clara Monroe has proven herself unfit to manage property or make decisions. The Monroe family will be assuming control of her late husband's estate, effective immediately. Anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with my father." Silence. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Clara's lips moved, shaping words without sound. "Please. Someone. Please." No one answered. Derek released her, and Clara crumpled to the ground like a puppet with cut strings. She lay in the alley filth, clutching her torn dress, feeling gravel press patterns into her cheek, and knew with absolute certainty that this was the end. Not of her life, perhaps. They'd let her live, probably, if she signed their papers and disappeared into whatever gray existence awaited women with nothing and no one. But the end of Clara. The end of hope. The end of believing tomorrow might be better than today. "Let's go," Derek said. "I need a drink after that ugliness." Footsteps retreated. The crowd began to disperse, people turning away with relief, eager to escape the uncomfortable scene and return to lives where such things didn't happen to them. Clara lay in the dirt and closed her eyes. "This is where I die," she thought with strange calm. "Not my body, just everything that made me me." "No." The word cut through Clara's surrender like a knife through silk. A voice, male, quiet, but carrying the kind of authority that made people stop walking and turn back. Clara forced her eyes open. Through tears and dust and the haze of shock, she saw a man standing at the alley mouth where Silas Cord had been. Tall, maybe 6'2", with shoulders built from hard work and a face weathered to saddle leather. He wore simple ranch clothes, denim pants, a faded shirt, a battered hat pulled low. No badge, no gun visible, nothing to mark him as different from any other cowhand in Wyoming, except his eyes. Even from where she lay, Clara could see those eyes, winter sky blue and absolutely cold. The eyes of a man who'd seen things that killed softer men's souls and survived anyway. The stranger stepped into the alley and his gaze swept over Clara's huddled form with an expression that might have been anger or might have been something more dangerous than anger. Then he looked past her to where Derek, Jake, and Silas had frozen at his interruption. "You got business here, mister?" Derek asked, trying to recapture his earlier bravado but not quite managing it. Something about the quiet man's presence had shifted the air pressure, made the afternoon feel like the moment before lightning strikes. "Business?" "No." The stranger moved closer, his steps unhurried but purposeful. "Just a problem with what I'm seeing." "You got a problem. Take it somewhere else." Derek's hand drifted toward his belt. "This here's family business. Woman's being taught a lesson about property and respect. That what you call it?" Not a question. The stranger crouched beside Clara, not touching her, but close enough that she could see the thin white scars crossing his knuckles, the deeper one along his jaw. The story of violence survived written on his skin. "Ma'am, can you stand?" Clara stared at him, uncomprehending. Was he real, or just another hallucination born from fear and pain? "Ma'am," he repeated, gentler, "I'm going to help you up now. That all right?" She managed the smallest nod. His hands, calloused, careful, helped her to her feet, and when she swayed, he steadied her with a touch so respectful it made her want to weep again. He shrugged out of his jacket and draped it around her shoulders, covering the torn dress, giving back a piece of the dignity that had been stolen. "Who the hell are you?" Jake demanded. "Nobody important." The stranger kept one hand on Clara's elbow, supporting her. "Just a man who doesn't like seeing 3 grown men beat on a woman in an alley." "She's Monroe property," Derek snarled. "You got no right. She's a person." The quiet man's voice dropped 10 degrees toward absolute zero. "And I'm taking her out of here. You got an objection, state it plain." The 3 Monroe men exchanged glances. Silas Cord's hand hovered near his gun, and Clara felt the stranger tense beside her, ready for violence but not seeking it. "You're making a mistake," Derek said finally. "Crossing my family, she's coming with me." 5 words, spoken soft as prayer and hard as iron. 5 words that somehow carried more weight than Derek's threats, than Jake's knife, than the entire Monroe family's 30 years of valley dominance. "Like hell she is!" Derek lunged forward, and the quiet man moved. Clara barely saw it happen. One moment, the stranger stood beside her. The next, he'd shifted into Derek's path with liquid speed. His fist connected with Derek's solar plexus in a short, brutal jab that folded the younger man like a bad poker hand. Derek went down gasping, and Jake started forward with his knife raised, and Silas Cord reached for his gun. The stranger kicked Jake's knee with a sickening crack and caught Silas's wrist mid-draw, twisting until the revolver fell from nerveless fingers and the hired gun followed it to the ground with a scream. 6 seconds, maybe less. 3 men on the ground, and the stranger hadn't even taken his hat off. "Anyone else?" He looked around the alley at the crowd that had pressed forward again to watch this new spectacle. His voice remained conversational, almost pleasant. "Anyone here want to argue about this lady's right to walk away?" Silence, deeper than before. The stranger nodded once, apparently satisfied. He turned back to Clara, and his eyes softened fractionally. "Can you walk? My horse is just down the street." Clara's voice cracked. She tried again. "I don't know you." "Name's Ethan Cole. I ranch about 15 miles north of here." He paused, seeming to consider his words. "I'm not going to hurt you, ma'am. I'm just going to take you somewhere safe, somewhere those men can't reach you. Then, if you want to leave, I'll bring you back to town myself. But right now, staying here would be a mistake. You understand?" Clara looked past him to where Derek was climbing to his feet, murder in his eyes. At Jake, nursing his shattered knee. At the crowd, still watching, still silent, still unwilling to help but more than willing to witness. She looked back at Ethan Cole's scarred, honest face and made the easiest decision of her life. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I understand." "All right then." Ethan's hand returned to her elbow, steady and sure. "Stay close to me." They walked out of that alley together, the broken widow and the solitary rancher, and the crowd parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. Clara kept her eyes down, unable to face the stairs, but she felt Ethan's presence beside her like a wall between herself and the world's cruelty. Behind them, Derek Monroe found his voice. "You're dead. You hear me, Cole? You and that bitch both. Nobody steals from the Monroe family and lives." Ethan didn't turn around. His hand on Clara's arm never faltered. They walked past the mercantile where the shopkeeper had watched her assault without intervening, past the sheriff's office where Sheriff Hutchins stood in the doorway, studying his boots with great interest, past the bank where Thomas had signed away their future to his family's generosity, past all the people who could have helped and didn't. At the end of Main Street stood a rangy bay gelding, ground-tied and patient. Ethan helped Clara mount, her first time on a horse in weeks, and her shaking legs could barely grip the stirrups. He swung up behind her, reached around to gather the reins, and for just a moment, Clara leaned back against his solid warmth and let herself breathe. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Home," Ethan said simply. "My home. For now." He urged the gelding into a walk, then a trot, then a ground-eating lope that carried them out of Coldwater and into the vast Wyoming territory beyond. Clara watched the town recede behind them, watched the faces blur and fade, watched the sight of her humiliation shrink to nothing against the enormous sky. She should have been terrified. She'd just left everything she knew with a complete stranger, a man who'd beaten 3 others unconscious in an alley without breaking a sweat. Logic said she should be screaming, fighting, demanding he take her back. But Clara Monroe had learned something in that alley, something that had been building through 3 months of isolation and cruelty. Sometimes the monsters you know are more dangerous than the strangers you don't. And sometimes, when you've lost everything, the only direction left is forward. They rode in silence for an hour, 2 hours, 3. The sun climbed to its apex and began its slow decline toward evening. The landscape changed from the clustered buildings of Coldwater to scattered ranches to open prairie where nothing moved but wind through grass and hawks circling overhead. Clara's shock began to lift in layers, like fog burning off morning fields. With awareness came questions, but every time she opened her mouth to speak, the words lodged in her throat. What could she possibly say? Thank you for saving me from public humiliation? Who are you really, and why did you help? What do you want from me in return? That last question scared her most of all. In Clara's experience, men didn't help women without expecting payment. Thomas had been different, gentle, kind, genuinely loving. But Thomas was dead, and the men who'd replaced him in her life were a different breed entirely. What price would Ethan Cole extract for his rescue? As if sensing her tension, Ethan spoke for the first time since leaving town. There's water in the canteen if you're thirsty, and jerky in the saddlebag, though it's tough as boot leather. I'm fine, Clara said automatically, though her mouth tasted like copper and dust. Suit yourself. Another mile passed in silence, then, we'll be there before dark. The ranch house is nothing fancy, but it's clean and private. You can rest there. Figure out what comes next. What comes next? Claire repeated hollowly. I don't even know what comes now. Now, you're safe. That's enough for today. Was it? Claire wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that simple answer and let everything else wait. But the questions kept coming, insistent as hunger. Why did you help me? You don't know me. You didn't owe me anything. Ethan was quiet for so long Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, had a sister once, Sarah. She was 19 when she married a man named Jacob Trent. Nice enough fellow, or so we thought. Had a ranch down in Colorado, seemed prosperous, treated Sarah real respectful during their courtship. He paused, and Clara felt his body tense behind her, some old pain surfacing. Changed after the wedding, like a switch got flipped. Started with words, telling Sarah she was stupid, worthless, couldn't do anything right. Then his fists. She hid it from family for 2 years, wearing long sleeves in summer, lying about bruises. Clara's breath caught. She knew this story. Every woman knew some version of this story. Finally got bad enough that Sarah ran, Ethan continued, showed up at our parents' ranch in the middle of winter with a broken arm and terror in her eyes. Jacob came after her 3 days later, drunk and angry, demanding his property back. My father tried to reason with him. Jacob shot my father dead on our front porch. Oh God, Clara whispered. I killed Jacob Trent that night, Ethan said, his voice utterly flat. Shot him 3 times in the chest while he was reloading. Law called it justified. Self-defense, protection of family. Didn't matter. My mother never forgave me for bringing that violence into our home, even though it saved Sarah's life. She died hating me, and Sarah, he exhaled slowly. Sarah married again 2 years later. Good man this time, gentle. They moved to Oregon, started fresh. Haven't seen her in 8 years. I'm sorry, Clara said, inadequate words for impossible pain. Don't be. I'm telling you this so you understand. I know what men like those Monroe boys are. I know what they do to women when nobody's watching, and I know how whole towns can turn blind rather than get involved. His arms tightened fractionally around her, not restraining, but sheltering. When I saw you in that alley, I saw Sarah, and I swore after my father died that I'd never stand by and let something like that happen again, no matter the cost. The Monroes will come after you, Clara said. Derek meant what he said. They'll let them come. No fear in Ethan's voice, no bravado either, just flat certainty. I've got 15 miles of open country around my ranch and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. They want trouble, they'll find it, but they won't find you. Clara closed her eyes, feeling something unknot in her chest. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of trust. The first fragile thread of belief that maybe, impossibly, the stranger meant exactly what he said. I don't have anywhere else to go, she admitted, the words bitter as poison. No family, no friends willing to risk themselves, no money. The Monroes will take my land whether I sign their papers or not. Her voice broke. I'm nothing. Nobody. Just like Derek said. No. Ethan's voice went hard. You're a woman who survived her husband's death, 3 months of harassment, and a brutal assault. You're still breathing, still fighting, still here. That's not nothing, Clara Monroe. That's everything. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, holding back a sob. How long had it been since someone had spoken to her with simple respect? Since someone had seen her as human rather than obstacle or property? Thank you, she managed, for what you did. For this. I don't know how to repay. Don't want repayment. Ethan's tone gentled. Just want you safe. Rest of it, we'll figure out as we go. The sun was kissing the western horizon when the ranch came into view. Not large, a simple clapboard house, a barn, a few outbuildings scattered across a valley where a creek ran silver through green grass. Cattle grazed on distant slopes, and horses moved like ghosts in a corral near the barn. It looked, Clara thought with a pang sharp as homesickness, like peace, like the life she'd imagined when Thomas had courted her with flowers and promises, like everything she'd lost. Ethan dismounted first, then helped Clara down. Her legs trembled when they took her weight, and she had to grab the stirrup to keep from falling. The adrenaline that had carried her through the past hours was draining away, leaving nothing but exhaustion and pain in its wake. Easy, Ethan murmured. He didn't touch her beyond steadying her elbow. House is just there. You go on in, I'll tend the horse, and be right behind you. Clara nodded mutely and stumbled toward the house. The front door was unlocked. No need for locks this far from town, apparently, and she pushed inside to find a space that matched its owner, sparse, clean, functional. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen table scarred from years of use, a pair of chairs near the hearth, stairs leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything neat, everything in its place, everything speaking of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. Or maybe just a man who'd forgotten how to live any other way. Clara sank into one of the chairs and buried her face in her hands. Now, finally, away from prying eyes and immediate danger, she could let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. The terror, the humiliation, the violation of being held down and mutilated like an animal. She reached up and touched the ragged remains of her hair, felt the uneven patches where Jake's knife had hacked away everything Thomas had loved to run his fingers through. Fresh tears came, hot and helpless, and once started, she couldn't stop them. Great! Wrenching sobs tore through her chest, emptying out everything she'd held inside for 3 months. The grief for Thomas, the fear of his family, the loneliness of isolation, the breaking point in that alley. She cried until she had nothing left, until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen and her whole body ached from the force of her sorrow. When she finally looked up, Ethan was standing in the doorway with a blanket in his hands and carefully averted eyes, giving her privacy even while offering comfort. I'm sorry, Clara croaked. I'm not usually... Don't apologize. Ethan stepped forward and draped the blanket around her shoulders. You've earned those tears 10 times over. Let them out. He moved to the kitchen, and Clara heard the sounds of a fire being built, water being pumped, dishes clattering. Domestic sounds, achingly normal. When had normal become something extraordinary? Ethan returned with a steaming cup of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory root substitute she'd been making do with, and a plate of cold venison and bread. Eat what you can, he said. Then there's a bedroom upstairs, first door on the right. It's yours for as long as you need it. Clara accepted the food with shaking hands. Where will you sleep? Barn's comfortable enough. Done it before. No, I can't take your bed. You can, and you will. Ethan's tone left no room for argument. The door has a lock on the inside. Use it. I won't bother you, won't come up unless you call for help. In the morning, we'll talk about what comes next. For tonight, just rest." He moved toward the door and Clara found herself calling after him. "Ethan?" He turned, his face shadowed in the dying light. "Why did you call me Clara? In the alley you called me Clara, but I never told you my name." A ghost of something, maybe a smile, maybe just sadness, crossed his features. "Small town, people talk. I'd heard about Thomas Monroe's widow, the woman his family was trying to run off her land. Heard she was alone and scared and too stubborn to quit." He met her eyes directly. "Heard right, it seems." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Clara alone in a stranger's house with a cup of cooling coffee and more questions than answers. But also, for the first time in 3 months, with something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over the valley like a benediction. Stars emerged one by one, hard, bright points in the infinite dark. A coyote called from the ridgeline, mournful and wild. And in the barn, Ethan Cole cleaned his rifle with methodical care, his eyes on the southern horizon, where Coldwater lay sleeping, and prepared for the war he knew was coming. Because men like the Monroes didn't forget insults. They didn't forgive defiance. And they sure as hell didn't let a lone rancher steal their property and walk away unpunished. The breaking point had passed. Now came the storm. Clara woke to the smell of bacon frying and sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For one disoriented moment, she thought herself back in the house she'd shared with Thomas, that the past 3 months had been nothing but a nightmare conjured by fever dreams. Then she moved, and her whole body screamed protest, muscles stiff from yesterday's violence, bruises blooming purple across her ribs where Derek had shoved her against the wall, her scalp tender where Jake's knife had done its brutal work. Reality crashed back with the weight of a falling boulder. She sat up slowly, taking inventory of her surroundings in the clear morning light. The bedroom was small but scrupulously clean, with whitewashed walls and a braided rug on the floor. A chest of drawers stood against one wall, a washstand with a cracked basin against another. The bed itself was simple but comfortable, the quilt smelling faintly of sage and wood smoke. On the washstand, someone had left a pitcher of fresh water, a clean towel, and a folded shirt that would swallow Clara whole but was infinitely better than her torn dress. The kindness of these small gestures made her throat tight. She washed as best she could with shaking hands, scrubbing away the alley's filth from her skin, but unable to scrub away the memory. When she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she had to stifle a gasp. The woman staring back was almost unrecognizable, hair chopped into ragged patches, bruises shadowing her cheekbones, eyes huge and haunted, and a face gone pale as bone. Clara touched the destroyed hair with trembling fingers. It would grow back, she told herself. Hair always grew back. But the image of herself kneeling in that alley, helpless and humiliated while the town watched, would never fade. That was carved into memory like words into stone. She pulled on Ethan's shirt, rolled up the sleeves until her hands emerged, and ventured downstairs on legs that still felt disconnected from her body. Ethan stood at the stove with his back to her, moving with the economical efficiency of a man long accustomed to caring for himself. He'd already eaten, judging by the single plate drying beside the sink, and was now preparing what looked like enough breakfast to feed 3 men. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's on the table. Breakfast'll be ready in a minute." Clara poured herself a cup with hands that only shook a little and sank into a chair at the kitchen table. The coffee was strong and bitter and utterly perfect. She wrapped both hands around the cup, letting its warmth seep into her bones, and watched Ethan work. In daylight, she could see him more clearly. He moved like a man intimately familiar with violence, balanced, aware, ready to react at any moment. But his hands, as he cracked eggs into a pan, were gentle. The contradiction fascinated her. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, still not looking at her directly, giving her space and privacy even in the same room. "Better than I expected," Clara admitted. "The bed is very comfortable." "Good. You needed rest." He plated bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread, then set the food in front of her before retreating to lean against the counter with his own coffee. Physical distance, Clara realized, to avoid making her feel trapped or crowded. The consideration in that small gesture made her chest ache. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, but her body responded to the fuel with gratitude. When had she last eaten a full meal? Yesterday morning, before everything shattered? We need to talk about what happens next, Ethan said quietly. But first I need to know what I'm dealing with. The Monroe family, how far are they willing to go to get your land? Clara set down her fork, appetite vanishing. As far as they need to. Thomas inherited that 160 acres from his grandfather, and it sits right between Clayton Monroe's main ranch and the river access he's been trying to control for years. With Thomas gone, I'm the only obstacle between Clayton and consolidating his holdings. And the law? Sheriff Hutchins is Clayton's second cousin, Clara said flatly. Judge Morrison owes the Monroe family money. The bank manager is engaged to Clayton's daughter. Everyone in Coldwater is either employed by the Monroes, related to them, or too scared to cross them. Ethan's jaw tightened. So, yesterday, in the alley, was never going to end with arrest or justice, if that's what you're wondering. Derek and Jake could have killed me in front of the whole town, and nobody would have done a thing. The bitterness in her voice surprised even Clara. That's what I've learned these past 3 months. Law only matters when powerful men decide it matters. That's not law. That's tyranny. Welcome to Coldwater, Wyoming. Clara took a long drink of coffee, using it to swallow back the acidic taste of anger and helplessness. Thomas knew what his family was like. That's why he made sure the deed was in my name only. Why he had our marriage documented with a lawyer in Cheyenne instead of locally. He tried to protect me, but... Her voice cracked. He didn't expect to die at 31. Nobody expects fever to take a healthy man in 3 days. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those winter sky eyes. Finally, he said, "The deed's legitimate?" "Yes. Registered and filed proper in Cheyenne. I have copies locked in a strongbox at the house." Clara paused. "Had copies. The Monroes have probably torn the place apart looking for them by now." "Maybe not. They think they broke you yesterday, think you'll come crawling back to sign their papers and disappear. Breaking into your house would be admitting they don't have legal standing." Ethan straightened, decision settling over him like a cloak. "We need to get those papers, today, before they realize you're not coming back on your own." Clara's hands went cold around her coffee cup. "Go back there? Ethan, if they catch us, they won't. The ranch is empty during the day, men out working, right? We slip in, get your strongbox, slip out, quick and quiet. And if someone sees us, then I'll handle it." No boast in his voice, just certainty, the same certainty that had faced down 3 men in an alley without flinching. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say it was too dangerous, too risky, too soon. But the thought of losing those deeds, the only proof of her legal right to the land Thomas had left her, was unbearable. Without them, the Monroes could claim anything. Forge documents, manufacture debts, erase her from existence as thoroughly as they'd tried to erase her dignity. "All right," she heard herself say. "But I'm coming with you." Ethan frowned. "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is." Clara set down her cup with enough force to crack porcelain. "I know where the strongbox is hidden, know the combination to the lock, and I'm not going to hide here like a frightened rabbit while you risk yourself for my property. If we're doing this, we're doing it together." She expected him to argue, to pull some masculine nonsense about protecting the helpless woman. Instead, Ethan studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Together, then. But we do it my way, understand? I say run, you run. I say hide, you hide. No arguments, no hesitation. These men already proved they're willing to hurt you. I won't give them a second chance." Agreed. They left within the hour, Ethan on his bay gelding and Clara on a smaller mare he'd saddled with surprising gentleness. The morning was crystalline and perfect, the kind of Wyoming day that made poets write foolish things about purple mountains and endless skies. Clara found the beauty almost offensive. How could the world be so lovely when everything in it was broken? They rode in watchful silence, Ethan's eyes constantly scanning the horizon for movement, for dust clouds, for any sign of Monroe riders. Clara's former property, she had to think of it that way now, as former, as lost, lay 6 miles from Ethan's ranch. nestled in a valley where Willow Creek ran year-round and cottonwoods grew tall enough to offer shade in summer. She'd loved it on sight when Thomas first brought her there as a bride. Loved the little house he'd built with his own hands, the garden she'd planted, the chickens that followed her around like feathered children. 3 months ago, it had been home. Now, approaching from the ridgeline with her heart hammering against her ribs, it looked like a trap waiting to spring. "Stay here," Ethan murmured, dismounting in a copse of trees that offered cover and a clear view of the buildings below. "Let me scout first." He moved down the slope like smoke, silent and purposeful, disappearing into the sage. Clara waited, counting her own heartbeats, her hands white-knuckled on the reins. 5 minutes passed. 10. Just when she was beginning to panic, Ethan materialized beside her horse, startling a gasp from her throat. "Sorry," he said, though he didn't look particularly sorry. "House is empty. Corral, too. Looks like they came through, doors busted, some furniture overturned, but they didn't burn it down or do serious damage. Probably figured they'd need it intact once they took ownership." Clara's jaw clenched. How thoughtful of them. They left the horses tied in the trees and approached the house on foot. Clara's heart climbed into her throat as they crossed the yard where she'd scattered feed for chickens just yesterday morning. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, splintered where someone had kicked it in rather than bothering with the latch. Inside was worse. Her tidy home had been ransacked with methodical cruelty. Drawers pulled out and dumped, their contents strewn across the floor. Dishes shattered in the sink. Thomas's clothes torn from the wardrobe and trampled. Her wedding dress, the one precious thing she'd owned, the dress her mother had sewn by hand before the cholera took her, slashed to ribbons and left in a heap like a dead thing. Clara made a small, wounded sound. "Don't look," Ethan said quietly. "Just get what we came for and go." She nodded jerkily and picked her way through the destruction to the bedroom. The bed she'd shared with Thomas had been flipped, mattress slashed, feathers scattered like snow. But the floorboards beneath, those were undisturbed. Clara knelt and counted 3 boards from the wall, then pried up the loose plank with shaking fingers. The space beneath was dark and cobwebbed, but the strongbox was exactly where Thomas had hidden it, untouched and secure. "Got it," she breathed, pulling the metal box free. It was heavy, substantial, locked tight. "Good. Now we—" The sound of horses cut off whatever Ethan had been about to say. Multiple horses, approaching at a canter from the south. Ethan's hand went to his hip, and Clara realized for the first time that he wore a gun today. A revolver in a worn holster, riding easy like he knew how to use it. "How many ways out of this house?" "Front door, back door, bedroom window." "Window. Now!" They ran for the bedroom as the horses pulled up outside. Men's voices, rough and familiar. Derek Monroe, she was certain, and several others. Clara's hands fumbled with the window latch while Ethan positioned himself beside the door, gun drawn, face carved from stone. The window stuck. Paint and swelling from last week's rain had sealed it shut. Clara threw her weight against it, panic rising, but it wouldn't budge. "Clara!" Derek's voice echoed through the house. "I know you came back, you stupid bitch! Your mare's got fresh tracks leading right to your door!" Footsteps in the main room, heavy boots on plank floors. Coming closer. Ethan grabbed Clara's arm and shoved her flat against the wall beside him, putting his body between her and the door. His gun came up, steady as stone, aimed at the doorway. "You might as well come out," Derek continued, his voice sing-song and mocking. "Nobody's coming to help you. Nobody cares. You're alone, Clara. Alone, and trespassing on Monroe property." The footsteps reached the hallway outside the bedroom. Clara could see Derek's shadow stretching across the floor, could hear his breathing, could smell the whiskey that seemed permanently attached to him. "Last chance," Derek said. "Come out peaceful, sign the papers, and maybe we'll go easy on you. Make us come in there." The shadow shifted. "Well, you remember what happened in the alley?" Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. Clara held her breath, the strongbox clutched to her chest like a shield. Derek stepped into the doorway. "Don't move." Ethan's voice could have frozen fire. "Hands where I can see them, nice and slow." Derek froze, his eyes going wide when he saw the gun aimed at his chest. "Cole, what the hell do you think you're doing?" preventing a murder, yours or mine, depending on your next move. This is Monroe property. This is Clara Monroe's property, legally deeded and filed. The woman you assaulted yesterday in front of 40 witnesses, the woman who has every right to be in her own home. Ethan's aim never wavered. Now step back, call off your men, and ride out. We'll forget this happened. Derek's face flushed ugly red. You're not in a position to make demands. 6 rounds in this cylinder say otherwise. How many men did you bring? 3? 4? I can drop you in 2 more before the survivors even clear leather. You want to test that math? A long, tense silence. Clara could hear other men moving in the house, could feel the situation spiraling toward violence with the inevitability of water flowing downhill. If shooting started in this confined space, people would die. Maybe her. Maybe Ethan. Maybe both. Derek, a new voice from the hallway, older and harder. Stand down. Derek's jaw worked, but he stepped back slowly, hands rising to shoulder height. Another man appeared behind him, Clayton Monroe himself, the family patriarch, 60 years old with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. Mr. Cole, Clayton said with poisonous courtesy, you're making a grave mistake. Seems to be my day for it. This woman is family business. The fact that she convinced you otherwise doesn't change legal realities. Legal realities? Ethan's laugh was sharp as broken glass. You mean the ones where your sons beat her in an alley, destroyed her property, and threatened to kill her? Those legal realities? My sons were correcting insubordination. Clara knows what's expected. Clara owes you nothing. Ethan shifted slightly, putting himself more fully between her and the Monroes. She's a widow, not a slave. Her land is hers, legally and morally. And if I have to put bullets in every man who thinks otherwise, that's what I'll do. Clayton's eyes narrowed. You'd murder over this? Self-defense isn't murder. Neither is protecting someone from assault. But if you want to stand there and debate law with a gun pointed at your son's heart, I'm happy to continue the conversation. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Clayton smiled, a cold thing with no humor in it. You've made yourself clear, Mr. Cole. We'll leave. But understand, you've declared war on the Monroe family. We don't forget. We don't forgive. And we sure as hell don't lose. That makes 2 of us. Clayton's hand fell on Derek's shoulder, pulling him back. Come on, boy. Let the heroes have their moment. We'll see them again real soon. The Monroes withdrew, footsteps retreating through the house, out the broken door, into the yard. Clara heard horses being mounted, heard the receding thunder of hoofbeats fading south. Only then did Ethan lower his gun. We need to go, he said, already moving to the window. They'll circle back with more men. I bought us maybe an hour. This time, with Ethan's help, the window came loose. Clara climbed through with the strongbox, dropped into the yard behind the house, and ran for the trees where they'd left the horses. Ethan came behind her, his gun still drawn, his eyes sweeping the ridges for movement. They mounted and rode hard, pushing the horses into a gallop that ate up ground and put distance between them and the house, where Clara's old life had died its final death. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. By the time they reached Ethan's ranch, the sun had climbed to noon and sweat darkened the horses' coats. Clara's hands were cramping from clutching the strongbox so tight, her body aching from the punishing ride. She slid from the saddle and would have fallen if Ethan hadn't caught her elbow. Inside, he said. I'll tend the horses. Clara stumbled into the house and collapsed at the kitchen table, the strongbox in front of her like evidence in a trial. Her hand shook as she worked the combination. Thomas's birthday, the numbers he'd made her memorize and swear never to forget. The lock clicked open. Inside, nested in oilcloth to protect from moisture, the deed to the property, Thomas's will, their marriage certificate, and a thick envelope Clara didn't recognize. She opened it with trembling fingers and found herself staring at a letter in Thomas's familiar, careful handwriting. Clara, it began, if you're reading this, I'm gone and things have gone wrong. I'm writing this while I'm still healthy, while I can think clearly about what might happen after I'm not around to protect you. You need to know the truth about my family, about what they're capable of. Clara's vision blurred with tears, but she forced herself to keep reading. 5 years ago, my uncle Daniel Monroe decided he wanted to leave the family business. He'd inherited a small ranch from his wife's father, and he planned to move there with his family and start fresh. My father, your father-in-law Clayton, told Daniel that Monroes don't quit. That family loyalty was everything. 3 weeks later, Daniel's ranch house burned down in the middle of the night. Daniel, his wife, and both their children died in the fire. The sheriff ruled it an accident, a lantern knocked over, they said. But I saw my brother Derek and cousin Jake riding back to the main ranch at dawn that morning, their clothes smelling like kerosene. I never said anything. I was 17 and terrified. But I knew. I've always known. If something happens to me, Clara, my family will come after you and the land. They'll use law or violence or whatever works. You can't fight them alone. But you can run. Take the deed, take what money there is, and go somewhere they can't reach you. California, maybe. Oregon. Anywhere far from Wyoming. Don't try to hold on to the property. It's not worth your life. I loved you from the first moment I saw you, and I'm sorry I'm leaving you alone like this. Be safe, my darling girl. Be smart. And please don't try to be brave. Your loving husband, Thomas. The letter slipped from Clara's nerveless fingers. Murder. Thomas had known his family had committed murder, had lived with that knowledge for years, had died knowing what they'd do to his widow. And he'd begged her to run. But running meant they won. Running meant Daniel Monroe and his family had died for nothing. Running meant Clara disappeared like smoke, and the Monroes consolidated their power, and the next person who defied them met the same fate. When Ethan came in from the barn, he found Clara sitting rigid at the table, her face pale as death, the letter clutched in white-knuckled hands. "What's wrong?" He crossed to her in 3 strides. "Clara, what happened?" She handed him the letter without speaking, watched his face as he read, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hands clenched hard enough to crumple the paper. "They killed his uncle's whole family," Clara whispered, "burned them alive in their beds. And everyone knows, and no one does anything, because the Monroes are too powerful to touch." Jesus. Ethan set down the letter with careful control. "Does anyone else know about this? Did Thomas tell anyone?" "I don't think so. He was too scared, too young. By the time he was old enough to do something, too much time had passed." "Then we use it." Ethan's voice went hard. "We take this letter to a federal marshal. This is murder, Clara. It doesn't matter how powerful the Monroes think they are. Federal law doesn't bend for local tyrants. The nearest federal marshal is in Cheyenne. 3 days' ride, and we'd have to go through cold water to get there." Clara shook her head. "They'd never let us pass. And even if we made it, would anyone believe a dead man's letter about a 5-year-old fire? Without evidence, without witnesses willing to testify. Then we find evidence. We find witnesses." "How?" Clara's voice rose, cracked. "Everyone in that valley is either related to the Monroes or terrified of them. You saw what happened in the alley. 40 people watched them brutalize me, and not one person stepped forward. Not one." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down facing her, his eyes fierce. "Then we make them step forward. We shine so much light on the Monroe family's crimes that nobody can ignore them anymore. We force the system to work the way it's supposed to." "That's not how the world works," Clara said bitterly. "Power protects power. It always has." "Maybe. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Ethan reached across the table and took her hands in his grip warm and solid and achingly gentle. "You asked me yesterday why I helped you. The truth is, I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't. And I can't live with myself knowing what these men have done and doing nothing about it." Clara looked down at their joined hands, at the calluses that marked a life of hard work, at the scars that told stories of survival. She thought about Thomas's letter, about his plea for her to run, to stay safe, to choose life over justice. But she also thought about Daniel Monroe's children, burning, about every other person the Monroe family had hurt or threatened or silenced over 30 years of unchecked power, about the woman in the alley, broken and humiliated while the world watched and did nothing. "I can't run," she heard herself say. "If I run, I become another person they erased, another warning to anyone who might resist. I won't do it, Ethan. I won't let them win." Something that might have been pride flickered across Ethan's scarred face. Then we make a stand. Together. Together, Clara repeated, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope. She wasn't ready for that yet. But something harder. Something that tasted like rage and righteousness mixed into steel. The Monroes had taken everything from her, her husband, her home, her dignity, her place in the world, but they hadn't taken her will to fight. And now, impossibly, she wasn't fighting alone. They spent the rest of that day planning. Ethan produced a map of the territory and marked locations. The Monroe Ranch, Clara's property, the surrounding homesteads. He listed names, ranchers who might be sympathetic, townspeople who'd shown hints of conscience, anyone who might be convinced to stand witness. Old Sam Tucker, Clara said, pointing to a spot northeast of town. He and Thomas were friends. The Monroes undercut his cattle prices last year and nearly ruined him. He might help. Might isn't good enough. We need certainty. There's no certainty in this, Clara said. Just people too scared or too decent. We work with what we have. As the sun set and shadows stretched long across the valley, they sat at Ethan's table and ate a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. Clara found herself stealing glances at this strange man who'd entered her life with violence and stayed with kindness, who asked nothing, offered everything, and seemed content to let silence fill the spaces where words felt inadequate. "What made you come to town yesterday?" she asked finally. "Of all the days, all the times, why then?" Ethan chewed slowly, considering. "Needed supplies. Wire, nails, couple other things. I go to Coldwater maybe once a month, always hated it. Town feels poisoned, you know, like something rotten underneath the pretty paint." "And you just happened to walk past that alley at exactly the right moment?" "Wrong moment, seems to me. 5 minutes earlier, might have stopped it before it started." He met her eyes. "But yeah, wrong place, wrong time, depending on your perspective." "Right place?" Clara corrected quietly. "Right time. If you hadn't been there—" She couldn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. "I was there. That's what matters." They cleaned up in companionable silence, and when darkness had settled fully outside, Ethan showed Clara how to load and fire his spare revolver. She'd never held a gun before. Thomas had kept a rifle for hunting, but never taught her to use it. Now, with Ethan's patient instruction, she learned the weight of the weapon, the tension in the trigger, the way the barrel jumped when fired. "Aim center mass," Ethan said. "Don't try for fancy shots. You're not trying to wound. You're trying to stop a threat. Understand?" Clara understood. She was learning a new language, the vocabulary of violence that might be the only thing standing between her and another alley, another humiliation, another ending. When they'd exhausted the evening and Ethan retreated to the barn, Clara climbed the stairs to her borrowed bedroom and lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. Cattle lowing in distant pastures, wind rattling the window panes, the house settling around her like an old friend finding comfortable position. She thought about Thomas's letter, about his fear for her, about his final plea for her to choose safety over justice. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room, to the memory of the man she'd loved. "But I can't run. I hope you understand." Outside in the barn, Ethan Cole sat with his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the southern horizon, watching for the trouble he knew was coming. He'd started something yesterday in that alley, drawn a line in the dust and dared powerful men to cross it. Now there would be consequences. Violence, probably. Maybe death. But for the first time in 8 years, since Sarah had moved to Oregon and left him alone with his guilt and his grief, Ethan felt something like purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting for something that mattered. And if that fight cost him everything, well, he'd already lost everything once before. He could do it again. The trouble came 3 days later, not with gunfire, but with the pretense of law. Clara was hanging washing on the line behind Ethan's house when she heard the horses. 4 riders approaching from the south at an easy canter, the morning sun glinting off something metal pinned to the lead rider's chest. Her hand stilled on the wet sheet she'd been pinning, her heart climbing into her throat. "Ethan!" she called, keeping her voice level despite the fear coiling in her gut. He emerged from the barn within seconds, rifle held loose but ready, his eyes already tracking the riders. When he saw the badge on Sheriff Hutchins' vest, his jaw tightened, but he didn't lower the weapon. The sheriff pulled up 20 feet from the house, his 3 deputies fanning out behind him in a formation that looked casual but wasn't. These were men comfortable with violence, their hands resting near their sidearms with practiced ease. "Cole," Hutchins said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "We got a problem." "That's so." Ethan didn't move from his position halfway between the barn and the house, didn't shift his grip on the rifle. "What kind of problem would that be, Sheriff?" "The kind where a citizen makes a formal complaint about assault and kidnapping." Hutchins pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and waved it like a flag. "Got a warrant here for your arrest. Says you attacked 3 men in town, threatened them with deadly force, and made off with Clara Monroe against her will." Clara's breath stopped. She moved forward, abandoning the laundry, her hands clenched into fists. "That's a lie. He saved me from—" "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside." Hutchins' eyes flicked to her cold and dismissive. "This is law business." "Law business," Claire repeated, fury burning through her fear like fire through paper. "You mean Monroe business. You stood in your doorway and watched them brutalize me, and now you're here to arrest the one man who helped?" "What I saw was a family matter being handled internal-like, and then an outsider inserting himself with violence. Now, Cole, you can come peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Ethan's finger rested alongside the rifle's trigger guard, not quite threatening but not quite safe either. "And if I tell you that warrants based on false testimony, that Clara came with me willingly to escape assault, then you can explain that to Judge Morrison at your hearing." Hutchins' smile was all teeth. "Due process, Cole. That's how civilized folk handle disputes." "Due process," Ethan's voice went flat. "In a court where the judge owes the Monroes money and the sheriff's their cousin. That the due process you're offering? I'm offering you a chance to settle this legal. You don't take it, well—" Hutchins' hand drifted toward his gun. "Resisting arrest is a serious crime, tends to end badly." Clara saw the calculation in Ethan's eyes, saw him weighing odds and outcomes. 4 armed men against 1, and if shooting started, she'd be caught in the crossfire. He could probably take 2 before they brought him down, maybe 3 if luck ran his way. But then he'd be dead and she'd be alone again, delivered right back into Monroe hands. "Don't," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "Please, Ethan, don't die for this." Something in her voice reached him. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease, but his finger moved away from the trigger. "All right, Sheriff. I'll come peaceful. But I want it on record that this arrest is bought and paid for by the Monroe family, and every man here knows it. You can tell that to the judge." Hutchins dismounted, pulling iron cuffs from his belt. "Hands out, Cole, nice and slow." Ethan set down his rifle with visible reluctance and extended his wrists. The cuffs clicked shut with a sound like bones breaking. Clara watched, helpless, as they took the man who'd saved her life and reduced him to a prisoner based on lies. "What about me?" she asked. "Am I under arrest too?" "You?" Hutchins looked her over with something like pity mixed with contempt. "No, ma'am. You're free to go. In fact, Mr. Clayton Monroe asked me to extend an invitation for you to come by the ranch, talk things over peaceful-like. He's willing to forget yesterday's unpleasantness if you're willing to be reasonable about the property situation." "Reasonable," Clara said, the word tasting like poison. "You mean if I sign over everything Thomas left me and disappear?" "I mean, if you accept reality. You're a woman alone with no prospects and no protection. The Monroe family is willing to take care of you, set you up with enough money to start fresh somewhere. That's generous, considering they murdered his uncle and his uncle's entire family 5 years ago." The words were out before Clara could stop them, sharp and reckless. "Considering they burned them alive in their beds." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift, their ears flicking nervously. Hutchins' face went carefully blank, but Clara saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprise, she realized with cold certainty, but calculation. He'd known. Of course he'd known. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Monroe," Hutchins said slowly. "You got any proof of this alleged crime?" Clara's hand moved toward her pocket where Thomas's letter rested, then stopped. If she showed them the letter now, they'd take it, destroy it, and then the only evidence of the Monroe family's atrocities would disappear like smoke. "I've got proof," she said instead. "Safe and secure. And if anything happens to me or to Ethan Cole, it goes straight to the federal marshal in Cheyenne." She was lying. She hadn't sent anything to anyone. But Hutchins didn't need to know that. Let him worry. Let him report back to Clayton that the widow had teeth, after all. Hutchins studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Well, that's between you and your conscience, ma'am. Cole, mount up. We got a cell waiting for you in town." They put Ethan on his own horse but tied his cuffed hands to the saddle horn. Humiliation designed to break a man's pride, Clara understood. Make him helpless as a child, dependent on his captor's mercy. Ethan met her eyes before they led him away. "Don't do anything stupid," he said quietly. "Stay here. Stay safe." "I'm done being safe," Clara replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She watched them ride south toward Coldwater, watched until they disappeared into the heat shimmer and distance, then turned back to the house with her mind already racing. Ethan had told her to stay, to be safe, to wait. But waiting meant letting the Monroes control the narrative. Waiting meant Ethan rotting in a cell while Judge Morrison took his time scheduling a hearing. Waiting meant giving them time to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and tighten their grip on the valley's throat. Clara was done waiting. She changed out of her work dress into riding clothes, braided back what remained of her butchered hair, and loaded Ethan's spare revolver with hands that no longer shook. Then she saddled the little mare and rode not toward Coldwater, but northeast, toward Sam Tucker's homestead. The old rancher answered her knock with a shotgun in his hands and suspicion in his eyes, but when he recognized Clara, the suspicion softened into something like sympathy. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, lowering the weapon. "Heard you had some trouble in town a few days back." "More than trouble, Mr. Tucker. They arrested Ethan Cole this morning on false charges. I need help." Sam's weathered face creased into deeper lines. "Help's a dangerous word these days, ma'am. Monroe family's got long memories and longer reach." "I know. I also know they undercut your cattle prices last year and nearly bankrupted you. I know you've got as much reason to hate them as I do." Clara met his eyes steadily. "Thomas wrote a letter before he died. In it, he confessed that his father and brothers murdered Daniel Monroe and his whole family 5 years ago, burned them alive to keep Daniel from leaving the family business." Sam's face went gray as old ashes. That fire was ruled an accident. It was murder. Thomas saw Derek and Jake riding home at dawn, smelling like kerosene. He was too young and too scared to speak up then, but he documented everything before he died. Clara pulled the letter from her pocket and let Sam read it, watched the old man's hands tremble as he took in Thomas's careful handwriting, his desperate confession. "Sweet mercy," Sam whispered. "Those poor babies. Daniel's children were 6 and 8 years old." "I'm taking this to the federal marshal in Cheyenne," Clara said. "But I need witnesses. People willing to testify about the Monroe family's other crimes, their intimidation, their violence. One letter might not be enough, but a pattern of behavior, testimony from multiple sources, that might tip the scales." "You're asking me to sign my own death warrant. I'm asking you to help me stop them from doing to someone else what they've already done to too many people." Clara's voice didn't waver. "Thomas couldn't speak up because he was scared. I understand that fear, Mr. Tucker. I've lived it, but I'm done being scared." Sam stared at the letter for another long moment, then carefully folded it and handed it back. "I'll testify. Can't promise what good it'll do, but I'll stand witness to what I know. The price manipulation, the threats when I wouldn't sell my water rights, all of it." Relief flooded through Clara so suddenly her knees went weak. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We might both hang for this." But Sam was already pulling on his coat, already checking his shotgun's loads. "You'll need more than just me, though. Mary Hendricks, she runs the boarding house in town. Her son got on the wrong side of Jake Monroe 2 years back. Boy disappeared, never found. Sheriff ruled him a runaway, but Mary knew better." "Will she talk?" "Maybe, if she thinks there's a chance of real justice." Sam settled his hat on his head. "Let's go find out." They rode together through the afternoon, two people with nothing left to lose, gathering witnesses like soldiers gathering weapons before battle. Mary Hendricks listened with tears streaming down her face, and agreed to testify about her missing son. A Mexican rancher named Carlos Ruiz described how Clayton Monroe's men had beaten him unconscious when he refused to sell his land, how the sheriff had done nothing. A young widow named Beth Crawford spoke haltingly about Derek Monroe's assault on her after her husband's death, how she'd been too ashamed and too frightened to report it. Story after story, crime after crime, a catalog of casual cruelty stretching back years. By the time sunset painted the western sky in shades of blood and gold, Clara had statements from 7 people willing to risk everything to speak truth. It wasn't enough to guarantee victory, but it was a start. She returned to Ethan's ranch after dark, exhausted and wired with nervous energy, to find she wasn't alone. A figure sat on the porch steps, barely visible in the starlight. A boy, maybe 16, thin and scared-looking. Clara's hand went to her gun before the boy raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot, ma'am, please. My name's Tommy Wright. I work for the Monroes, or I did until—" His voice cracked. "I need to talk to you." Clara approached cautiously, keeping distance and the revolver between them. "Talk then." "I was there that day. In the alley." Tommy's face was pale as bone in the dim light. "I saw what they did to you. Derek and Jake and Silas. I saw it all, and I should have stopped them, should have helped, but I was too scared. I'm still scared, but I can't stay quiet anymore." Clara's heart began to pound. "You're willing to testify?" "I'm willing to do more than that. Tomorrow morning, they're planning to kill you." The words came out in a rush. "Mr. Clayton's done being patient. He told Derek to take 4 men out to Willow Creek at dawn, wait for you by the crossing. Said you'd come back to your old place eventually, and when you did, they were supposed to make it look like an accident. Thrown from your horse, maybe. Drowned in the creek." Ice flooded Clara's veins. "How do you know this?" "I was mucking stalls when they were planning it. They didn't see me, thought they were alone. But I heard every word." Tommy's hands were shaking. "After what I saw them do to you, after keeping quiet for so long, I couldn't let them murder you too, so I rode out here soon as I could slip away." Clara stared at this frightened boy who'd finally found his courage and felt something shift in her chest. 1 witness had become 7, and 7 had become 8. The silence that protected the Monroes was beginning to crack. "Come inside," she said. "You're not going back there. They'll know I ran. They'll figure out I warned you. Then you'll stay here where they can't reach you. Tomorrow, we're riding to Cheyenne together. You, me, and everyone else willing to speak truth." Clara opened the door and gestured Tommy inside. "Tonight, you're safe. I promise you that." But safety was a fragile thing, as Clara learned at dawn when she woke to the sound of gunfire. She bolted from bed, grabbed the revolver, and raced downstairs to find Tommy pressed against the wall by a window, his face stark with terror. Outside, the morning was chaos, men on horseback circling the house, at least 6 of them, firing shots into the air and shouting demands. Clara recognized Derek's voice. "Send out the boy, Clara. He's Monroe property, and you got no right to harbor him." "Property," Clara spat, moving to the opposite window to get a better view. The riders had positioned themselves strategically, cutting off escape routes, their horses dancing nervous at the gunfire. "He's a human being, and he's staying here." "You got till the count of 10, then we're coming in." Derek fired another shot, this one blowing out a window on the 2nd floor. Glass rained down like hail. 1, 2! Clara's mind raced. 6 men, probably armed with rifles as well as sidearms. She had a revolver with 6 shots and a terrified boy who'd likely never fired a weapon in his life. The odds were impossible, unless she changed the game. "Tommy," she said, her voice steady despite the fear screaming through her blood. "Can you ride?" "Yes, ma'am, but—" "There's a rifle in the bedroom upstairs, Winchester repeater. Get it, load it, and when I give the signal, you start shooting out the back windows. Aim high. I don't want you killing anyone, but make noise. Make them think there's 2 of us." "What are you going to do?" Clara checked her revolver's cylinder, snapped it closed. "Something stupid." She waited until Derek reached 7, then threw open the front door and stepped onto the porch with her gun held low but visible. Derek's counting stopped. The riders pulled up, confusion rippling through their ranks. They'd expected a siege, not surrender. "I'm done hiding," Clara announced, pitching her voice to Carrie. You want to kill me? Do it in daylight, where the whole territory can see what you are. Clara. Derek's face twisted with something between anger and uncertainty. Get back inside. Why? So you can burn the house down with me in it, like you did to Daniel Monroe? Clara descended the porch steps slowly, deliberately. That's the family technique, isn't it? Fire makes everything look accidental. You don't know what you're talking about. I have Thomas's letter. I have his confession that you and Jake murdered your uncle and his children. I have 7 witnesses willing to testify to your family's crimes, and tomorrow all of it goes to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. She was 20 feet from them now, standing in the open yard, a target they couldn't miss. So if you're going to shoot me, Derek, do it now. Put a bullet in an unarmed woman in front of all your men. Let them see exactly what kind of people they work for. The silence stretched taut as wire. Clara saw the calculation in Derek's eyes, saw him weighing murder against consequences. His hand tightened on his rifle, and she knew with crystalline certainty that he was going to do it. He was going to shoot her down like a dog, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. Then Tommy Wright stepped onto the porch behind her with the Winchester to his shoulder and his voice ringing clear. You fire that gun, Mr. Monroe, and I'll put a bullet through your spine. I swear it on my mother's grave. Derek's head snapped around. Tommy? Boy, you're making a mistake. Well, no, sir. Biggest mistake I ever made was staying quiet when I should have spoken up. I saw what you did to Mrs. Monroe in that alley. I know what you're planning here, and I'll testify to all of it in any court that'll listen. You'll hang for this, Derek snarled. Treason against the family. It's not treason to tell the truth. Tommy's rifle never wavered. Now you and your men turn around and ride out, or we'll see who's faster. For a long, terrible moment, Clara thought Derek would call the bluff. His finger was on the trigger, his face mottled red with rage. But then one of his men, a hired hand Clara didn't recognize, cleared his throat nervously. Boss, maybe we should… Shut up! It's just, the boys got the drop on you, and if this goes bad, we're all witnesses to murder. That's hanging offense, even for… I said shut up! But Derek was lowering his rifle fractionally, the moment passing. This isn't over, Clara. Not by a long shot. You think you can ride to Cheyenne? You won't make it 10 miles. Then I'll die trying, Clara said. But I'll die fighting, not cowering. Remember that. She turned her back on them, an act of either courage or insanity, and walked back to the house with Tommy covering her retreat. She climbed the porch steps, feeling 6 rifles aimed at her spine, feeling the weight of their murderous intent like physical pressure. But no shots came. The Monroe riders wheeled their horses and galloped away, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of hoofbeats fading into distance. Clara made it inside before her legs gave out. She collapsed against the wall, shaking so hard her teeth chattered, the revolver slipping from nerveless fingers. That, Tommy said, his voice high and unsteady, was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen. Both, probably. Clara forced herself to breathe, to think. We need to go now, before they come back with more men and better plans. What about Mr. Cole? We can't just leave him in jail. We're not leaving him. We're getting him the only help that matters, federal law. Clara pushed herself upright, her body still trembling but her mind clearing. The judge won't schedule his hearing for days, maybe weeks. That gives us time to reach Cheyenne, file charges, and bring back a marshal with authority that supersedes the sheriff's. And if the Monroes catch us on the road, then at least we'll die trying to do the right thing, instead of living with doing nothing. They rode out within the hour, not toward Coldwater where Ethan sat in his cell, but east through backcountry toward the stage road that ran to Cheyenne. Clara pushed the pace hard, knowing every moment's delay gave the Monroes time to organize pursuit, to spread word, to cut off escape routes. They made 20 miles by midday, stopped to water the horses at a creek, and were preparing to ride on when Clara heard it. Hoofbeats, coming fast from the west. Tommy, get in the trees, she hissed, but it was too late. The riders crested the ridge, 3 of them, and Clara's hand went to her gun before she recognized the leader. Sam Tucker, with Carlos Ruiz and Mary Hendricks riding behind him. Mrs. Monroe, Sam called. Thank heaven we caught you. Word spreading through the valley like wildfire. The Monroes are offering $500 to anyone who brings you back, dead or alive. 500? That was more money than most ranchers saw in a year, enough to tempt even decent people. How long do we have? Hours, maybe less. Every hired gun and bounty hunter in the territory will be riding this way. Sam's face was grim. You need protection, so we're coming with you. Sam, you don't have to Yes, I do. We all do. He gestured to the others. Beth Crawford's gathering the rest of the folks who agreed to testify. We're all riding to Cheyenne together. Figure there's safety in numbers, and if we're going to do this, might as well do it right. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. You could get killed. We're all going to die someday, Mrs. Monroe. Might as well die for something that matters. Sam checked his shotgun's loads with practiced hands. Now, let's ride before those bounty hunters catch our scent. They rode through the afternoon, their group swelling as they picked up the other witnesses. Beth Crawford with her fierce eyes and firmer jaw. Young Carlos Ruiz, who'd been beaten for refusing to yield his land. Mary Hendricks, still clutching her son's photograph like a talisman against grief. 10 people total by the time the sun started its descent, 10 people who'd decided that silence was more dangerous than truth. They made camp that night in a box canyon with good sightlines and defensible positions, posting watches and shifts. Clara took the midnight watch, sitting with her back against stone and her revolver in her lap, staring out at the vast Wyoming darkness. She thought about Ethan in his cell, about whether he was sleeping or lying awake, wondering if she'd listened to his plea for her to stay safe. She thought about Thomas's letter pressed against her heart, about the weight of other people's courage resting on her shoulders. She thought about the girl she'd been 3 days ago, kneeling in an alley while the world watched her destruction. That girl was gone, burned away like chaff, leaving something harder in her place, something that wouldn't break, wouldn't bend, wouldn't be silenced. The Monroes had tried to erase her. Instead, they'd forged her into a weapon that would cut right through their empire's rotten heart. Tomorrow, they would reach the stage road. Tomorrow, they would start the final push toward Cheyenne and justice. But tonight, Clara Monroe sat watch over 9 sleeping people who'd risked everything to follow her lead, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The breaking point had passed. The storm had arrived, and Clara was done running from the thunder. Dawn broke cold and clear over the box canyon, painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose that seemed almost mocking in their beauty. Clara woke the camp quietly, watching as people roused themselves from shallow sleep and checked weapons with the grim efficiency of soldiers before battle. They'd made it through the night unmolested, but that grace period was ending. Sam Tucker had scouted at first light and returned with news that made Clara's stomach clench. Riders were converging from multiple directions, at least a dozen men drawn by the Monroe bounty like wolves to blood scent. We need to move fast, Sam said, keeping his voice low so as not to panic the others. There's a narrow pass 3 miles east that'll take us to the stage road. Once we're there, we're in the open, but also harder to ambush. Problem is, getting to the pass before they cut us off. Clara studied the rough map Sam had sketched in the dirt. How much time do we have? Hour, maybe less. They're coming from the south and west, trying to box us in against the mountains. Sam's weathered face was grim. We got women and a boy in this group, Mrs. Monroe. If it comes to shooting, then we shoot. Clara's voice carried steel she hadn't known she possessed a week ago. Everyone here knew the risks when they agreed to come. We don't turn back now. They saddled horses and broke camp with urgent efficiency, moving out in a tight group with the strongest riders on the flanks. Clara positioned herself near the front with Tommy right beside her, the boy's face pale but determined, his borrowed rifle held with white-knuckled intensity. The narrow pass Sam had mentioned was really more of a defile, a slash through tumbled rock where the horses had to move single file and the cliff walls rose high enough to block the sun. It was defensible if you held the high ground, but they were coming from below, exposed and vulnerable. They were halfway through when the first shot rang out. The bullet whined off rock 2 feet from Clara's head, spraying stone chips and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Her mare spooked sideways, nearly pitching her from the saddle, and behind her Mary Hendricks screamed, "Ambush!" Sam's voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone down! Get to cover!" But there was no cover in the narrow pass, just stone walls and the killing ground between. Clara threw herself from her horse as another shot cracked, felt the wind of the bullet's passage across her cheek, and scrambled behind a boulder barely large enough to shield her torso. Above them, on the rim of the pass, she could see movement, men with rifles taking position, black silhouettes against the morning sky. At least 6 shooters, maybe more, with perfect angles down into the pass where Clara's group was pinned like fish in a barrel. "We're trapped!" Beth Crawford called from somewhere behind Clara. "They've got us dead to rights." She was right. The ambushers held every advantage: high ground, cover, crossfire positions. If Clara's group tried to retreat back through the pass, they'd be shot from behind. If they tried to push forward, they'd ride directly into concentrated fire. They were caught in a perfect kill box, and the men above them knew it. "Hold your fire," a voice boomed from above, echoing off stone walls. Clayton Monroe himself, Clara realized, come to personally oversee their destruction. "You're surrounded and outgunned. Throw down your weapons and surrender, and nobody else has to die." "Nobody else?" Clara shouted back, rage overriding fear. "You mean besides Daniel Monroe and his children? Besides Mary Hendrick's son? Besides everyone your family has murdered over the years?" "Careful with that tongue, Clara. You're in no position to make accusations." "I'm in a perfect position. I've got Thomas's letter detailing everything, and 9 witnesses willing to testify in federal court." Clara's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed strong. "You can kill us all right here, Clayton, but that just adds 10 more murders to your tally. How many bodies will it take before someone finally stops you?" A pause. Then, "You think federal law means anything out here? You think a marshal will ride into my territory and arrest me based on the ravings of a hysterical widow?" "You're deluded, girl. This ends one way. You give me that letter, you sign over the land, and maybe I let your friends ride away. Maybe." "Maybe isn't good enough," Sam Tucker called. "And we're not giving you nothing. You want us dead, you'll have to work for it." Another shot, this one deliberate and precise, striking the rock 6 inches from Sam's head. Warning fire, Clara understood. They could have killed him, but chose not to. Clayton was still hoping to end this without a bloodbath that might draw unwanted attention. But that restraint wouldn't last forever. "You've got 1 minute," Clayton shouted. "Then my men open fire and don't stop until everything in that pass stops moving." Clara's mind raced, calculating impossible odds and finding no solution. They couldn't fight, outgunned and outmaneuvered, couldn't retreat, trapped between stone walls with shooters at their backs, couldn't negotiate. Clayton wanted them all dead or silenced, and promises made to dead men cost nothing. They were going to die here. All of them, for the crime of speaking truth to power. Clara looked at the people huddled behind inadequate cover, saw the fear in their eyes mixed with defiant courage, and felt something crack open in her chest. These people had followed her, had trusted her promise that justice was possible, that the system could be made to work if only they were brave enough to try. She'd led them to slaughter. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she didn't know if anyone could hear her over the thunder of her own heartbeat. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be." Tommy Wright was pressed against the same boulder, his young face dirt-streaked but resolute. "This was always how it was going to end for folks like us. At least we're dying for something real." 30 seconds, Clayton's voice counted down their lives. "Make your peace." Clara closed her eyes, thought about Ethan locked in a cell waiting for rescue that would never come, thought about Thomas buried in cold ground with his secrets, thought about all the people the Monroe family had crushed under their boot heels over 3 decades of unchecked tyranny. She thought about the girl in the alley, destroyed and humiliated, and she thought, not like this, not surrendering, not giving them the satisfaction. If she was going to die, she'd die fighting. Clara raised her revolver, sighted on one of the silhouettes above, and fired. The recoil jarred her shoulder, the report deafening in the narrow confines. She had no idea if she hit anything, but it didn't matter. The gesture mattered. The refusal mattered. "Open fire!" Clayton roared, and the world exploded into gunfire and chaos. Bullets whined and ricocheted off stone in a deadly percussion. Clara flattened herself behind the boulder, making herself as small as possible, as around her the others returned fire with desperate courage. Sam's shotgun boomed. Carlos Ruiz's rifle cracked in steady rhythm. Tommy Wright worked his Winchester's lever action, firing and reloading with hands that never fumbled despite the fear that must have been screaming through him. But their fire was scattered, poorly aimed, coming from inferior positions. Above them, The Monroe gunmen had all the advantages and were using them methodically. Bullets chewed chunks from the rocks sheltering Clara's group, spraying stone shrapnel that cut like glass. Then Mary Hendricks cried out, a sharp sound of pain and surprise. Clara risked a glance and saw the older woman clutching her shoulder, blood seeping between her fingers, her face gone white with shock. "Mary!" Beth Crawford scrambled to her side, pressing her own scarf against the wound. "Someone help her! She's hit!" Clara's heart plummeted. First blood drawn, and it wouldn't be the last. This was no longer an ambush. It was an execution proceeding at the speed of gunfire. She had maybe 3 bullets left. Sam was down to his last shotgun shell. The others were running low on ammunition, and the Monroe shooters showed no signs of relenting. Another minute, maybe 2, and they'd be defenseless. This was how it ended. Not with justice, not with truth prevailing, but with good people dying in a nameless canyon while their killers walked away unpunished. Clara squeezed her eyes shut against tears of rage and frustration, and that's when she heard it. New gunfire, but from a different direction. Coming from behind the Monroe positions, from the canyon rim where no one should have been. The ambushers' fire faltered, confused, as men began shouting above. Clara dared to look and saw impossible chaos erupting on the rimrock, the Monroe shooters wheeling around to face a new threat, their perfect positions suddenly compromised, and riding hard down the canyon wall, taking impossible angles with the reckless courage of a man with nothing to lose, came Ethan Cole. He must have broken out of jail somehow, must have ridden half the night to reach them, must have scouted the Monroe positions and circled behind for a flanking attack. His rifle spoke in rapid, deadly precision, and Clara saw 2 Monroe men go down before the others even registered the new threat. "Ethan!" The name tore from Clara's throat, disbelief and hope and terror mixing into something incandescent. "You're supposed to be in jail!" "Jail's got a back window." Ethan's voice carried over the gunfire, rough with exertion. "Figured you'd need help doing something stupid." He fired again, forcing the Monroe shooters to divide their attention between 2 fronts. It wasn't enough to turn the tide. They still had numbers and position, but it broke their focus, gave Clara's group precious breathing room. "Everybody mount up!" Sam bellowed, hauling Mary Hendricks onto his horse despite her protests. "We push through now while they're distracted." It was madness. Riding forward into gunfire, trusting speed and chaos to carry them through the kill box. But staying meant dying, so Clara grabbed her mare's reins, swung into the saddle, and kicked the horse into a gallop without letting herself think about the bullets that would find her. The narrow pass became a nightmare of thundering hooves and screaming ricochets. Clara bent low over her mare's neck, making herself small, feeling bullets tug at her clothes and whine past her ears close enough to kiss. Beside her, Tommy Wright rode with his eyes squeezed shut and his jaw clenched, trusting his horse to navigate while he held on for dear life. One of Carlos Ruiz's men took a bullet through the thigh and nearly fell, saved only by Beth Crawford grabbing his saddle and keeping him upright. The horses panicked and plunged, wild-eyed with terror, but their riders drove them forward through sheer will and desperation. And above them, Ethan Cole's rifle kept speaking, methodical and merciless, pinning down Monroe shooters who tried to track the fleeing riders. He'd positioned himself perfectly, close enough to threaten them, distant enough to make himself a difficult target, using the terrain with the skill of someone who'd learned to fight in worse places than this. They burst out of the narrow pass into open ground with the morning sun full in their faces. Clara risked a backward glance and saw Ethan wheeling his horse, firing one last covering shot, then galloping after them as the Monroe men regrouped and returned fire with vengeance. "Don't stop," Sam shouted. "The stage road's 2 miles ahead. We make it there. We're in public view. They can't massacre us where witnesses can see." 2 miles. It might as well have been 200. Clara's mare was already lathered, breathing hard, pushed beyond safe limits. Behind them, the Monroe riders were mounting up, preparing pursuit, fresh horses against exhausted ones. The math was brutal and simple. They weren't going to make it. But then, impossibly, Clara heard something that didn't belong in this desperate chase. The rattle and creak of wagon wheels, the jingle of harness, coming from ahead. She crested a small rise and saw it, the stage road, and rolling along it, a merchant's wagon piled high with goods, and driven by an elderly man who took one look at the chaos bearing down on him and immediately hauled on his reins. "Help!" Clara screamed, driving her mare straight toward the wagon. "Federal witness under attack! Get the sheriff in Cheyenne!" The merchant stared at her like she'd sprouted wings, but something in Clara's wild appearance, the chopped hair, the blood-spattered clothes, the desperate courage in her eyes, convinced him. He stood up on his wagon seat and began waving his hat, shouting at the top of his lungs. "Witnesses here! Attack on the road! Someone get the law!" And behind Clara, Clayton Monroe's pursuit pulled up short. They were still on open ground, still within rifle range, but no longer invisible. The stage road meant travelers, meant word spreading to Cheyenne, meant federal attention they couldn't afford. Clayton sat his horse at a distance, his face twisted with frustrated rage, and Clara met his eyes across 50 yards of Wyoming grassland. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her continued existence was statement enough. "You didn't break me. You didn't silence me. And I'm still coming for you." Ethan reached her side, his rifle still ready, his face carved from granite. "You hurt?" "No. Mary took a bullet and one of Carlos's men, but they're alive." Clara couldn't quite believe it. "You broke out of jail." "Window bars were rusted, took some work, but nothing I couldn't handle." He scanned the ridgeline where Monroe riders sat watching, calculating. "This isn't over. They'll regroup. Try again." "I know, but we made it to the road." Clara turned to the merchant, who was staring at all of them like they were circus performers. "Sir, we're riding to Cheyenne to file federal charges. Can you carry word ahead? Tell them Clara Monroe is coming with testimony about multiple murders, and if anything happens to her, the evidence goes public." The merchant nodded slowly. "Lady, I don't know what you're mixed up in, but you look like you've been through hell itself. I'll carry your message. You have my word." "Thank you." Clara felt something unknot in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first fragile possibility of it. They rode on, their group battered and exhausted but unbroken, with Ethan falling into position beside Clara like he'd always been there. She wanted to ask him how he'd found them, why he'd risked everything to ride to their rescue, what price he'd pay for breaking jail and attacking Monroe men. But the answers could wait. For now, it was enough that he was here, that they were alive, that Cheyenne lay ahead like a promise of justice too long delayed. They reached the territorial capital by nightfall, 10 riders transformed by dust and blood and sleeplessness into something that made people stop and stare. Clara led them straight to the federal marshal's office, dismounted on legs that barely held her weight, and walked through the door with Thomas's letter clutched in one hand and her ruined dignity wrapped around her like armor. The marshal on duty was a lean man in his 50s named Jacob Hendricks, no relation to Mary. He took one look at Clara's ragged hair, at the blood on Mary's shoulder, at the grim determination in 11 pairs of eyes, and set down his coffee. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you look like you've got a story to tell." "I've got more than a story, Marshal. I've got documented evidence of murder, conspiracy, assault, and corruption stretching back 5 years. I've got witness testimony. And I've got names, powerful names, men who think themselves above the law." Clara laid Thomas's letter on his desk like a declaration of war. "The question is, are you willing to do something about it?" Marshal Hendricks picked up the letter, began to read, and his expression shifted from polite interest to grim attention. When he finished, he looked up at Clara with something like respect in his eyes. "The Monroe family of Coldwater?" "Yes, sir. They've been untouchable for 30 years. Sheriff's their cousin. Judge owes them money. They've got half the territory on their payroll or under their thumb." Hendricks set down the letter carefully. "You understand what you're asking? The resources it'll take, the investigation, the danger to everyone involved?" "I understand I watched them hack off my hair in an alley while 40 people did nothing. I understand they murdered a man and his wife and 2 small children to protect their empire. I understand they've spent 3 days trying to kill me and everyone willing to speak against them." Clara's voice didn't waver. "What I don't understand, Marshal, is why any of that should make me stop." Hendricks studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Mrs. Monroe, I'll open an investigation, but I need formal statements from everyone here, and I need them tonight before memories fade or fear sets in. Can you do that?" "We can." Clara looked at her companions. Sam Tucker with his shotgun across his knees, Mary Hendricks holding her wounded shoulder, young Tommy Wright still gripping his rifle like a lifeline, Ethan Cole standing silent and solid at her back. "We're ready." They spent the next 4 hours giving statements, each witness recounting their piece of the terrible puzzle. Tommy Wright described the alley assault in detail that made the marshal's jaw clench. Mary Hendricks testified about her missing son with tears streaming down her face. Sam Tucker cataloged years of price manipulation and threats. Carlos Ruiz showed the scars from his beating, and Clara read Thomas's letter aloud, her voice breaking only once when she reached the part where her husband begged her to run, to choose safety over justice, to let his family's crimes go unpunished. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered to his memory, "but I can't do what you asked. I won't." By midnight, Marshal Hendricks had enough testimony to warrant immediate action. He called in 2 deputies and began drafting arrest warrants: Clayton Monroe, Derek Monroe, Jake Monroe, Silas Cord, Sheriff Hutchins, and 4 other men named as accessories to various crimes. "We'll ride at first light," Hendricks said. "Full federal authority, backed by territorial law. The Monroe family's reign ends tomorrow." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that justice would finally prevail, that the system would work the way it was supposed to. But she'd learned hard lessons about the gap between law and justice, between what should happen and what did happen when powerful men decided consequences didn't apply to them. "Marshal," she said carefully, "Clayton Monroe won't surrender peacefully. He'll fight. People will die." "Probably." Hendricks met her eyes without flinching. "But that's not a reason to let him keep terrorizing this territory. Sometimes the cost of justice is blood, Mrs. Monroe. Question is whether we're willing to pay it." They found lodging at a boarding house, the marshal paying from federal funds since none of them had money for rooms. Clara collapsed onto a thin mattress in a shared room with Mary and Beth, every muscle screaming protest, her mind spinning too fast for sleep. She'd done it. Against impossible odds, through violence and terror and the constant threat of death, she'd gotten her testimony to federal authorities. She'd lit a fuse that would explode the Monroe Empire. But the explosion hadn't happened yet, and she knew Clayton well enough to know he wouldn't go down without one final desperate play. She was right. The attack came 2 hours before dawn, when the boarding house was deep in sleep and the streets of Cheyenne were empty, save for a drunk stumbling home. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of wood crackling and knew immediately what was happening. Fire. The Monroe family's favorite weapon. "Everyone up!" she screamed, already rolling from bed, already coughing on smoke that was seeping through the floorboards. "The house is burning! Get out!" Chaos erupted, women screaming, men shouting, the roar of flames growing louder by the second. Clara grabbed Mary Hendricks, who was still groggy from laudanum the doctor had given her for the bullet wound, and half-dragged her toward the stairs. The first floor was already engulfed, flames climbing the walls like living things, consuming everything with hungry efficiency. The front stairs were impassable, the back stairs. Clara ran for them and found them blocked by a pile of furniture someone had deliberately stacked, trapping the upper floor's occupants. "Windows!" Ethan's voice cut through panic. He was already at the hallway window, using his rifle butt to smash out the glass. "Drop's about 12 feet! We can make it!" Clara helped Mary to the window, watched Ethan climb through and hang from the sill to shorten the drop, then let go and roll when he hit the ground. He came up on his feet, already reaching up. "Lower her down! I'll catch her!" They got Mary through, then Beth Crawford, then the others one by one, working with desperate speed as the fire roared closer and the smoke grew thick enough to strangle. Clara went last, her hands slippery with sweat on the window frame, and when she dropped, Ethan caught her with sure hands and set her on her feet. "Everyone out?" he demanded. Clara did a quick count. 10 people, all accounted for, all alive. "Yes, where's the marshal?" "Here!" Hendricks emerged from the front of the building, his face smudged with soot, his revolver drawn. Someone barred the doors from outside, piled kindling against the walls. This was arson, pure and simple. "The Monroe family," Clara said. "They sent someone to kill us all, destroy the evidence." "They failed." Hendricks gestured to his deputies. "Get these people to the marshal's office, post guards, and someone wake up the territorial governor. We need military support for tomorrow's arrests. The Monroes just escalated this into a shooting war." They spent the remainder of the night in the marshal's office, drinking bitter coffee and watching the boarding house burn to ash while Cheyenne's volunteer fire brigade fought to keep the flames from spreading. By dawn, nothing remained of the building but smoking timbers and the acrid smell of destruction. But Clara's testimony was safe. The witnesses were alive, and Marshal Hendricks had added attempted murder to the list of charges being drawn up against Clayton Monroe. As the sun rose over Cheyenne, Clara stood at the window of the marshal's office and watched riders assemble in the street below. Federal marshals, territorial militia, men with badges and guns, and the authority of law behind them. An army, small but determined, riding to Coldwater to bring down an empire built on fear. Ethan came to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "You don't have to come," he said quietly. "You've done enough, Clara. More than enough." "I'm coming." She turned to face him, saw the concern in those winter sky eyes. "They burned my house, tried to burn me alive, and they're probably going to fight like cornered animals. I won't miss it. I won't let them think for 1 second that they broke me." Ethan smiled, small and fierce. "Didn't think they had. Just wanted to give you the choice. I'm done being given choices by men who think they know better." But Clara took his hand, squeezed briefly, grateful for the gesture beneath the words. "Let's go finish this." They rode out as the sun climbed toward noon, 20 armed men and one woman with butchered hair and fire in her eyes, heading west toward Coldwater and the reckoning that was 30 years overdue. The Monroe Empire was about to fall, and Clara would be there to watch it burn. The ride to Coldwater took 2 days, and every mile felt like riding toward Judgment Day. Marshal Hendricks kept the pace steady but relentless, his federal authority a shield that made sheriffs in the small towns they passed through stand aside and watch with careful neutrality. Word traveled faster than horses in this territory, and by the time they crossed into the valley where the Monroe Ranch sprawled across prime grazing land, everyone knew what was coming. Clara rode near the front of the column, her borrowed horse steady beneath her, Ethan close enough that their stirrups occasionally brushed. She'd barely slept during the journey, her mind turning over possibilities and outcomes like cards in a dealer's hands. Best case, Clayton Monroe saw the federal badges and surrendered peacefully. Worst case, he'd fortified his ranch and was preparing for a siege that would end with bodies scattered across Wyoming grassland. She suspected the truth would fall somewhere between those extremes, in that gray territory where desperate men made catastrophic choices. They reached Coldwater at midday, riding down Main Street with the territorial militia's flag snapping in the wind and Marshal Hendricks at the head like an avenging angel in dusty trail clothes. The town that had watched Clara's humiliation in silence now watched her return with 20 armed men at her back, and she saw the calculation in every face they passed. The Monroe family's power was being tested. Finally, after 30 years of unchecked tyranny, someone had come with enough authority to push back. Hendricks pulled up in front of the sheriff's office and dismounted with deliberate calm. "Mrs. Monroe, Mr. Cole, you'll wait here with Deputy Marshal Chen and 4 militia. The rest of us are riding to the Monroe Ranch to serve arrest warrants. If shooting starts, you stay in town where it's safe." "Marshal," Clara began, but Hendricks cut her off with a raised hand. "This isn't a debate. You're a witness, not a soldier. I need you alive to testify." His voice gentled fractionally. "You've been brave enough, ma'am. Let us finish what you started." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to ride to the Monroe Ranch and see Clayton's face when the law finally caught up with him. But Ethan's hand on her arm stopped her, and when she looked at him, she saw the wisdom in his eyes. "He's right," Ethan said quietly. "We've done our part. Let the law do the rest." So Clara stood in the dusty street and watched the federal marshals and militia ride out, 15 men heading toward a confrontation that would either end the Monroe Empire or cement it forever. The town held its breath. Shopkeepers stood in doorways. Women gathered on boardwalks, whispering behind their hands. Even the usual traffic of wagons and horses seemed to pause, as if the entire world was waiting to see which way the balance would tip. Sheriff Hutchins emerged from his office with his hands raised and his face carefully blank. Deputy Marshal Chen had him in handcuffs within seconds, reading charges that included conspiracy, accessory to assault, and obstruction of justice. "This is a mistake," Hutchins said, but his voice lacked conviction. Clayton Monroe will have you all hung for this. Clayton Monroe is about to be arrested for murder, Chen replied flatly. You'll both have plenty of time to discuss your legal options from adjacent cells. They locked Hutchins in his own jail, a piece of poetic justice that made Clara's chest tighten with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close. One piece of the Monroe machine dismantled, one small crack in the foundation. But the real reckoning was happening miles away, and all Clara could do was wait. The first gunshot reached them an hour later, distant but unmistakable. Then another and another, building into a sustained rattle that spoke of serious resistance. Clara's hands clenched on the porch railing where she'd been standing vigil, her knuckles white, her whole body rigid with fear for men she barely knew, but who were risking everything to deliver justice. They're fighting, she whispered. Clayton's fighting. He was always going to fight, Ethan said. He'd positioned himself beside her, his rifle across his knees, watching the southern horizon where smoke was beginning to rise. Men like him don't surrender. They burn everything down rather than admit defeat. The gunfire continued for 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Clara counted shots, tried to distinguish rifle fire from pistols, listened for the terrible silence that would mean it was over. Beside her, the townspeople watched with expressions ranging from fear to vindication, and Clara realized that many of them had been waiting for this moment as long as she had. They'd just been too frightened or too complicit to act. When the gunfire finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. They waited another hour before riders appeared on the southern road. Clara's heart climbed into her throat as she counted. Fewer than the 15 who'd ridden out, but more than she'd feared. Marshal Hendricks led them, his face grim but satisfied, and behind him rode his deputies with prisoners in tow. Clayton Monroe sat his horse with his hands bound and his face carved from granite, showing nothing. Derek rode behind his father with blood on his shirt from a shoulder wound, his earlier arrogance replaced by shock. Jake Monroe was draped across his horse's neck, unconscious or dead. Clara couldn't tell which. And Silas Cord, the hired gun, had his hands cuffed and terror in his eyes that suggested he'd finally realized his employers couldn't protect him from federal justice. Clara descended from the porch on legs that trembled, her eyes locked on Clayton's face. He met her gaze without flinching, and she saw no remorse there, no acknowledgement of guilt. Just cold calculation and the promise of future violence if he ever got the chance. "It's over, Clayton," she said, pitching her voice to Carrie. "Your empire, your reign of terror, all of it, over." "Nothing's over until I say it's over," Clayton replied, his voice like gravel. "You think federal law means anything here? This is my territory, girl. My family built this valley, and families like mine don't fall to accusations from nobodies." Not accusations, evidence, testimony, murder charges backed by witness statements and documented confession. Clara moved closer, no longer afraid of this man who'd tried so hard to destroy her. "Thomas told me everything before he died. About Daniel, about the fire, about the children you burned alive to protect your precious empire. It's all written down, all documented, all going to trial." Something flickered in Clayton's eyes then, not fear exactly, but the first crack in his absolute certainty. Thomas was weak, always was. Couldn't even keep his wife in line. Thomas was decent. That's what you call weak, because you can't imagine caring about anything except power. Clara's voice shook with rage held barely in check. But decency won in the end, Clayton. His letter, his conscience, his final act of love, it brought you down. Marshal Hendricks dismounted and gestured to his deputies. "Get them locked up. Separate cells, armed guards around the clock. Nobody talks to them without my authorization, and if anyone tries to break them out, shoot first and file paperwork later." They hauled the Monroe men away, and Clara watched them go with a satisfaction so fierce it was almost physical. 3 days ago, she'd been beaten in an alley while the world watched and did nothing. Now she stood in the same town street and watched her tormentors dragged to justice in chains. It should have felt like victory. It felt like the first deep breath after nearly drowning. "Anyone hurt?" Clara asked Hendricks, dreading the answer. 2 militiamen wounded, nothing fatal. Jake Monroe took a bullet in the leg when he tried to shoot his way out. The hired hands at the ranch mostly surrendered once they realized we had federal warrants. Turns out loyalty to the Monroe family only runs as deep as the paycheck. Hendricks pulled off his hat and wiped sweat from his brow. Found something else, too. A room in the ranch house, locked from outside, with a young woman inside. Mexican girl, maybe 17, looks like she'd been held there for weeks. She's not talking yet, too traumatized, but I'd bet money she's another crime to add to Clayton's list. Clara's stomach turned. Of course there was more. There was always more with men like the Monroes, layers of cruelty and exploitation going deeper than anyone wanted to look. Will she testify? Eventually, maybe. For now, we've got her safe with a doctor and a woman from the church to look after her. One more nail in Clayton's coffin, even if she never says a word. The next week passed in a blur of legal proceedings and revelation. Judge Morrison was arrested on corruption charges when his financial records showed 20 years of Monroe bribes. A new judge was appointed from the territorial capital, a stern woman named Eleanor Grant, who listened to testimony with steel in her eyes and no patience for objections bought with blood money. The trial was set for 3 weeks hence in Cheyenne, giving prosecutors time to build their case and witnesses time to prepare. Clara spent those weeks in a kind of limbo, staying at Ethan's ranch because she had nowhere else to go, helping him with chores because idle hands gave her too much time to think. They worked side by side in companionable silence, mending fences, tending livestock, existing in a space between the violence that had brought them together and the uncertain future that stretched ahead. Sometimes Clara would catch Ethan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something complicated mixing concern with respect, and perhaps something deeper. But he never pushed, never demanded, just offered his presence and his protection without asking for anything in return. On the 10th day after the arrests, Clara rode back to her old property for the first time since the confrontation with Derek and Clayton. The house still stood, ransacked but not destroyed, and she walked through rooms that had once meant home and now felt like a museum of someone else's life. She found her wedding dress in the bedroom, the one her mother had sewn, still slashed to ribbons. Found Thomas's clothes still scattered where Monroe men had thrown them. Found the empty space under the floorboards where the strongbox had been hidden, and realized with sudden clarity that she couldn't live here anymore. Too many ghosts, too much pain. This house had been her prison before it was ever her home, and staying here meant living in a tomb of memory. She was standing in the kitchen, making this decision, when she heard a horse outside. Her hand went automatically to the revolver she now wore at her hip, old habits from a week of living in fear, but she relaxed when she recognized Ethan's bay gelding. He dismounted and stood in the doorway, respecting her space. "Thought you might want company." "I'm fine." "I know you are. Doesn't mean you need to be alone." Ethan stepped inside, his eyes sweeping over the destruction. "Rough coming back here." "It's not home anymore," Clara said. "Maybe it never really was. Thomas and I were happy, but we were also isolated, surrounded by his family's hostility. I thought if I just held on long enough, things would get better. Now he's gone and I'm—" Her voice caught. "I'm free, I think, but I don't know what to do with freedom." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You could sell the land. Take the money and go somewhere fresh, somewhere the Monroe shadow doesn't reach. California, maybe. Oregon. Is that what you think I should do?" "I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night without nightmares." Ethan met her eyes directly. "But if you're asking what I'd prefer you stayed. The ranch could use a partner, someone to help build it into something bigger, and I could use—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "I could use someone who understands what it's like to fight for something that matters, someone who doesn't quit when things get hard." Clara's breath caught. "Ethan, are you asking me to—" "I'm asking if you want a partnership, business arrangement, equal shares, separate living spaces if that's what you want. No pressure, no expectations beyond honest work and shared purpose." His scarred face was carefully neutral. "Anything more than that, if it happens in its own time. But first, I'm offering you a place that's yours by right and choice, not by accident of marriage or inheritance." It was the most he'd ever said at once, and Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the recognition that love might be possible someday with this quiet, damaged man who'd stood between her and destruction without asking for anything in return. "I'd like that," she said. "A partnership. something built on choice instead of circumstance. Then we'll make it legal. Get it in writing, filed proper in Cheyenne. Your land combined with mine, everything split equal. We build something neither of us could build alone. Clara crossed the kitchen and held out her hand like she was sealing a business deal, which in a sense she was. Ethan took it, his grip firm and warm and surprisingly gentle for hands so scarred by violence. Partners, Clara said. Partners, Ethan agreed. They stood like that for a moment in the ruins of Clara's old life, making wordless promises about the future. Then Ethan released her hand and stepped back. Trial starts in 11 days. You ready? As ready as I'll ever be. Are you? She knew Ethan would have to testify too, would have to face questions about breaking jail and attacking Monroe men in the canyon ambush. I'm ready to tell the truth. What happens after that is up to the law. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Clara. That letter Thomas wrote, the one where he begged you to run, you ever regret not taking his advice? Clara thought about the girl she'd been a month ago, before the alley, before Ethan, before she'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to fight despite it. She thought about Daniel Monroe's children burning, about Mary Hendricks' missing son, about the Mexican girl locked in a room at the Monroe Ranch. No, she said firmly. Running would have meant they won. It would have meant Thomas died for nothing, and all their other victims disappeared without justice. I don't regret fighting back, Ethan, only that I didn't fight back sooner. The trial began on a crisp October morning in Cheyenne's territorial courthouse, a building designed to impress with its columns and marble floors and the implicit promise that justice lived within its walls. Clara entered wearing a new dress purchased with money borrowed from Sam Tucker, her butchered hair pinned back as neatly as possible, her spine straight and her hands steady. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, people standing in the aisles, more crowding the doorways hoping to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. The Monroe trial had become something more than local justice. It was a referendum on whether powerful men could be held accountable, whether the system worked for everyone or just for those with money and guns. Clayton Monroe sat at the defense table with two expensive lawyers from Denver, his face showing nothing. Derek beside him, shoulder bandaged, anger radiating from him in waves. Jake on crutches, his wounded leg making him wince with every movement. And in the gallery, their family and supporters, ranchers and businessmen who'd profited from Monroe dominance, watching with barely concealed hostility. Clara took her seat in the witness section with Ethan on one side and Sam Tucker on the other, her small army of allies, and felt the weight of every eye in the courthouse. Judge Eleanor Grant entered, and the room fell silent. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much courtroom corruption to tolerate any more. She took her seat behind the bench and surveyed the assembled crowd with the authority of someone who'd earned her position through competence, not connections. This court is now in session, she announced. The territory versus Clayton Monroe, Derek Monroe, Jake Monroe, and Silas Cord on charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, assault, arson, kidnapping, and corruption of public officials. Will the defendants please rise? The Monroe men stood, and Clara felt a fierce satisfaction at seeing them answer to authority for the first time in their lives. The prosecution began methodically, building their case piece by piece. They entered Thomas's letter into evidence, each word read aloud in the courtroom's absolute silence. They called Tommy Wright to the stand, and the boy described the alley assault in detail that made women in the gallery gasp and men shift uncomfortably. They called Mary Hendricks, who testified about her missing son through tears that wouldn't stop. Called Carlos Ruiz, who showed his scars. Called Beth Crawford, who spoke quietly but firmly about Derek's assault on her, each witness adding another layer to a portrait of systematic violence and abuse. When they called Clara to the stand, she walked forward with her head high and her heart hammering. The defense attorney, a slick man named Peterson, watched her approach with the expression of a predator scenting blood. The prosecutor, a territorial attorney named Williams, led her through the events of the past month with gentle precision. Clara described her husband's death, the Monroe family's immediate pressure, the escalating threats. She described the alley in detail that made her voice shake but never break, and when Williams asked her to identify her attackers, She pointed directly at Derek and Jake without hesitation. Those two men held me down and cut off my hair while a crowd watched. They tore my dress and humiliated me publicly, and they did it to terrorize me into signing over my legal property. Objection. Peterson was on his feet. The witness is characterizing events with inflammatory language. Overruled, Judge Grant said coolly. The witness is describing events as she experienced them. Continue, Mrs. Monroe. Clara told it all. The broken door at her house, the confrontation with Clayton and Derek, the ambush in the canyon, the burning of the boarding house in Cheyenne, every crime, every threat, every moment of terror. And when she finished, she looked directly at Clayton Monroe and saw nothing in his eyes but cold calculation. He still thought he'd win, still believed money and power could override evidence and testimony. Then Peterson stood for cross-examination, and Clara braced herself. Mrs. Monroe, he began smoothly, you've painted quite a picture of victimization, but isn't it true that you had considerable financial motive to make false accusations against the Monroe family? No. No? You didn't stand to gain your late husband's property if his family could be removed from the picture. The property was already mine. Thomas's will was clear. But the Monroe family contested that will, didn't they? Claimed debts owed, questioned the validity. They lied, Clara said flatly. And they used violence to try to force me off land that was legally mine. Those aren't false accusations, Mr. Peterson. Those are documented facts. Peterson's smile thinned. Documented by a letter written by a dead man who can't be cross-examined, by witnesses who have their own grudges against the Monroe family. Are you suggesting we all coordinated our testimony? That Mary Hendricks invented her missing son? That Carlos Ruiz beat himself unconscious? That I somehow cut off my own hair in a public alley? Clara's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. The Monroe family spent 30 years terrorizing this territory, and the only reason they were never stopped is because people like you made excuses for them. Mrs. Monroe, I'm done being silent. I'm done being afraid. And I'm done pretending that powerful men deserve protection from the consequences of their crimes. Clara turned to face the jury directly. Thomas Monroe wrote that letter because his conscience couldn't bear the weight of his family's sins. He died knowing what they'd do to me, and he tried to warn me, tried to protect me. But I chose to fight instead of run, because running means evil wins, and I won't let evil win. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. Judge Grant's gavel came down hard. Order! I will have order! Peterson tried several more lines of attack, but Clara didn't break. She'd survived too much to be intimidated by a lawyer's tricks. When she finally stepped down, she met Ethan's eyes and saw pride there, uncomplicated and fierce. The trial continued for 3 more days. Ethan testified about breaking jail and riding to the canyon rescue, accepting responsibility for his actions but maintaining he'd had no choice. Federal witnesses were under attack and local law enforcement was compromised. The judge looked skeptical but allowed it. The Mexican girl from the Monroe Ranch finally spoke, haltingly, about being taken from her family's homestead and held captive for weeks. Her testimony was devastating in its quiet horror, and Clara saw several jurors wipe their eyes. Finally, the prosecution called their last witness, a surprise that made the courtroom gasp. One of the hired hands from the Monroe Ranch, a man named Tom Brennan, who testified that he'd been present when Daniel Monroe's house burned and had overheard Clayton and Derek planning it. They said it had to look like an accident, Brennan said, his voice rough. Said the kerosene would burn hot enough that no one could prove arson. Said Daniel's wife and kids were collateral damage, regrettable but necessary to send a message. Clayton's lawyer objected strenuously, claimed the testimony was hearsay, but Judge Grant allowed it as a co-conspirator's statement. The damage was done. The jury had heard multiple witnesses testify to a pattern of violence and murder stretching back years. Closing arguments were brief. The defense claimed it was all lies and conspiracy by people with grudges. The prosecution pointed to the overwhelming weight of evidence, the multiple independent witnesses, the documented confession. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they filed back in, Clara's hands were clasped so tight in her lap that her fingers had gone numb. Ethan sat beside her, his presence steady, and she drew strength from his quiet confidence. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Grant asked. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find the defendant Clayton Monroe? Guilty. The word fell like a hammer blow. The courtroom erupted. Clara closed her eyes and felt something break loose in her chest. Not quite tears, not quite relief, but something profound that had been held in suspension since the moment Derek's hand first wrapped around her throat in that alley. They found Clayton guilty on all charges. Derek guilty on assault and conspiracy. Jake guilty on assault and conspiracy. Silas Cord guilty as an accessory. Judge Grant sentenced them each in turn, her voice carrying through the chaos. Clayton Monroe, for the murders of Daniel Monroe, Sarah Monroe, and their 2 children, for conspiracy to commit murder, for assault, and for corruption. I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead. Derek Monroe, for assault and conspiracy. I sentence you to 20 years hard labor. Jake Monroe, for assault and conspiracy. I sentence you to 20 years hard labor. Silas Cord, for accessory to assault and attempted murder. I sentence you to 15 years hard labor. Clara sat through the sentencing in a kind of daze, unable to quite process that it was over. 30 years of unchecked tyranny ended in a courtroom with words and evidence and the weight of justice, finally, impossibly, applied equally. They led the Monroe men away in chains, and Clayton's eyes found Clara one last time. No plea for mercy, no acknowledgement of guilt, just pure hatred radiating across the courtroom. She met his gaze without flinching and watched him disappear through the door that would lead him to a gallows and the end he'd earned. Outside the courthouse, Clara stood in autumn sunshine and felt the world settle around her like a coat that finally fit properly. People approached, witnesses who'd testified, townspeople who'd made the journey to Cheyenne, strangers who'd followed the trial in newspapers, all of them wanting to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her she'd been brave. Clara accepted their words with quiet grace, but inside she was thinking about Thomas's letter, about his plea for her to run and stay safe. She'd disobeyed him, had chosen danger over safety, had risked everything for the slim possibility of justice. And justice had prevailed. Impossibly, improbably, justice had won. What now? Ethan asked later, after the crowds had dispersed and they stood alone on the courthouse steps. Clara thought about the question, about all the possibilities that stretched before her like open prairie. She could sell her land, take her money, disappear to California or Oregon or anywhere the Monroe name didn't carry weight. She could start over completely, become someone new. Or she could build something real on the foundation of everything she'd survived. Now, she said, we go home. We file the partnership papers, combine the ranches, and start building something that'll last. Something honest and good that nobody can take away. Home, Ethan repeated, testing the word like he'd forgotten its meaning. I like the sound of that. They rode back to Wyoming together, 2 people remade by violence into something stronger than they'd been alone. The autumn colors were beginning to turn, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and Clara felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope. Real hope, not the fragile, desperate kind that shatters at the first touch of hardship, but something solid and earned through survival. The ranch looked different when they arrived, or perhaps Clara was different, seeing it now not as a temporary refuge but as a foundation for the future. They spent the next weeks working side by side preparing for winter, making plans for spring expansion. Clara proved to have a head for numbers and a talent for negotiation that made selling their combined cattle yield twice what Ethan had managed alone. Sam Tucker and Carlos Ruiz came to help with the fence lines, and somehow they stayed for dinner and the conversation stretched late into the evening, plans being made, a community forming from the scattered pieces of people who'd stood together against tyranny. Tommy Wright asked if he could work the ranch instead of returning to his family, and they took him on, teaching him the business from the ground up. Mary Hendricks came to visit, her shoulder healed, bringing news that the Mexican girl from the Monroe Ranch had been reunited with her family and was slowly recovering. Piece by piece, the valley was healing. The Monroe Ranch had been seized by the territory and parceled out to families who'd lost land to Clayton's predations. New businesses opened in Coldwater now that the atmosphere of fear had lifted. A new sheriff was elected, Sam Tucker's son, a young man with integrity and a badge he'd actually earned. Winter came hard and cold, but the ranch was ready. Clara and Ethan worked through snowstorms and bitter temperatures, keeping the cattle safe, maintaining buildings, existing in a rhythm that felt like partnership evolving slowly into something more. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling soft outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, Ethan found Clara standing at the window looking out at the white landscape. "Thinking about Thomas?" he asked quietly. "Thinking about everything. A year ago, I was married and lonely and trapped without realizing it. 6 months ago, Thomas died and I thought my life was over. 3 months ago, I was beaten in an alley and certain I'd never be whole again." Clara turned to face him. "Now I'm here. Free, partnered, building something that matters. It doesn't feel real sometimes." "It's real," Ethan said. He moved to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "You made it real by refusing to quit, refusing to be broken. That takes more strength than most people ever have to find." "I had help." Clara looked at him, at this scarred, quiet man who'd walked into her worst day and changed everything. "You could have left me in that alley, could have walked away at any point, but you didn't." "Couldn't," Ethan corrected. "Something about you, the way you kept getting back up no matter how many times they knocked you down, I couldn't walk away from that. Still can't." Clara's breath caught. They'd been dancing around this for months, this thing growing between them that was more than partnership but hadn't yet been named. Now, in the firelight and snow silence, it felt like the moment to be brave one more time. "I'm not ready to remarry," she said honestly. "Thomas has only been gone 6 months, and I'm still learning who I am without him. But someday, when enough time has passed—" She hesitated. "Would you wait for someday?" Ethan's smile was small but genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his usually guarded face. "Clara, I've been waiting 8 years for something worth staying in one place for. I can wait however long you need." She kissed him then, brief and gentle, a promise rather than a claim. When she pulled back, Ethan's hand came up to cup her scarred head, where her hair was finally growing back and soft and even. "You're beautiful," he said, and she could hear the truth in it. Not beautiful despite her scars, but beautiful including them, every mark of survival adding to rather than subtracting from her worth. Spring came eventually, as it always did, bringing green grass and new calves and the endless work of ranching. Clara's land claim was legally confirmed, her deed registered in Cheyenne without challenge. She and Ethan combined their properties officially, creating one of the larger operations in the territory. They hired help, young men like Tommy who needed second chances, families displaced by the Monroe Empire's fall, people looking for honest work with fair wages. The ranch grew, prospered, became known for treating its workers well and dealing honestly in all its business. Clara's hair grew back, and she kept it shorter than before, a choice rather than a violation. She learned to shoot with real skill, learned to handle the books, learned to negotiate with buyers who tried to underestimate her until she proved them wrong. She became known throughout the territory as the woman who'd brought down the Monroe Empire, and that reputation opened doors that would have stayed closed to a mere widow. She used that influence carefully, advocating for other women in difficult situations, helping establish a fund for families who'd lost property to Monroe crimes, pushing for legal reforms that would make it harder for powerful families to corrupt local law enforcement. And through it all, Ethan was there, patient, steady, giving her space to grow while offering support when she needed it. Their partnership deepened, evolved, became something that didn't require constant definition or declaration. A year after the trial, on a warm spring evening, Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house they'd expanded together and looked out over land that was hers not by accident or marriage, but by choice and courage. Ethan came to stand beside her, his presence as natural as breathing now. "Marry me," he said. No preamble, no elaborate proposal. Just the question, direct and honest. Clara smiled. "Yes." They were married on a Saturday in June, in a small ceremony at the ranch with Sam Tucker and Mary Hendricks standing witness. No church, no crowd, just two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something worth keeping. Clara wore a simple blue dress, and Ethan wore his Sunday best, and Tommy Wright played fiddle while they spoke their vows. "I promise to stand beside you," Clara said, holding Ethan's scarred hands. "To build with you, fight alongside you when necessary, and trust you with my truth." I promise partnership and honesty, respect and loyalty. I promise to be whole on my own so I can choose you freely every day. I promise to honor your strength, Ethan replied, to never mistake your kindness for weakness or your gentleness for surrender. I promise to stand between you and harm when I can, and stand beside you when you fight your own battles. I promise partnership built on choice, not need, and love that grows from respect. They sealed it with a kiss while their small gathering cheered, and when Clara looked up at her husband, her partner, her friend, her choice, she saw reflected back the same fierce joy she felt in her own chest. This was what victory looked like. Not the courtroom verdict, not Clayton Monroe swinging from a gallows, but this. Two broken people made whole by the decision to keep fighting, to keep standing, to keep building despite everything the world had thrown at them. Years passed. The ranch prospered. Clara and Ethan had two children, a boy and a girl, who grew up hearing stories about their mother's courage and their father's quiet strength. The Monroe name faded from local memory, replaced by newer stories, better legacies. Clara never forgot what had happened in that alley, never lost the scars that violence had carved into her soul. But she learned to carry those scars like badges of honor rather than marks of shame, learned that survival could be its own form of victory. She stayed in touch with the other witnesses, watching Mary Hendricks remarry and find late-life happiness, seeing Carlos Ruiz build his ranch into something substantial, receiving occasional letters from the Mexican girl who'd been rescued from the Monroe Ranch and gone on to become a teacher. Tommy Wright stayed on the ranch, eventually becoming foreman, and then married Beth Crawford in a ceremony that had half the territory in attendance. They built a house on the edge of Clara and Ethan's property and raised their own children there, creating another layer of chosen family. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children asleep, Clara would sometimes sit on the porch with Ethan and think about the long road that had brought them here, about Thomas's letter and his plea for her to run, about the moment in the alley when she'd thought her life was ending, about Ethan stepping through the crowd with ice in his eyes and saying 5 words that changed everything. "She's coming with me." "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked once, following her thoughts with the ease of long familiarity. "Choosing to fight instead of disappearing? It would have been safer." Clara considered the question, looking out over land she'd earned, at children who bore her strength in their bones, at a life built on truth instead of silence. "No," she said finally. "Safe isn't the same as whole, and I'd rather be whole and scarred than safe and silent." "Good," Ethan said, taking her hand, "because I'm glad you stayed. Glad you fought. Glad you chose this life." "So am I," Clara replied, and meant it with every fiber of her hard-won, battle-scarred, absolutely free soul. The story that began with brutality in an alley had ended with partnership on a porch, with love born from respect, with justice earned through courage. The widow nobody wanted had become the woman everyone remembered, not as a victim, but as a fighter who'd refused to let cruelty have the final word. Clara Monroe had survived. More than that, she'd prevailed. And in the end, that was the only victory that truly mattered.